She was there, and then she was not there. A bride, on her wedding day, in front of 40 people, holding her groom's hand, just vanished. She didn't leave through any door. She didn't make a sound. She didn't collapse. Nothing. All that was left behind was a dreadful, sweet smell of orange blossom, except there were no orange blossoms anywhere in that church. And the groom? He couldn't even feel the moment her hand left his. Just empty space. Nobody saw her leave. Nobody understood what happened. The local police said it was bridal nerves, but what Sherlock Holmes uncovered beneath the floor of that church, that will send chills down your spine. Now, before we begin, let me tell you something. If you're watching this right now, you're part of the Holmes Deduction Diaries family, and that makes you special. You're not just someone who listens to stories. You think, you analyze, you deduce. So here's what I want you to do today. Before the video ends, drop your guess in the comments. Who do you think made the bride disappear, and why? Let's see who among you has the sharpest detective mind. And while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, and your age. I genuinely want to know how far our Holmes Deduction Diaries family has spread across the world. Now, let us return to the railway platform at Farncombe Junction, where at that moment nothing in England seemed capable of producing a mystery worth the name. Chapter 1. The Scent of Orange Blossom. There is a particular quality to the air of a provincial railway platform in late April that belongs to no other season and no other place. It carries with it the dampness of turned fields, the faint sweetness of hedgerow blossom not yet fully opened, and beneath these, the mineral tang of iron rails warming in intermittent sun. I mention these details not from sentiment, but because they are inseparable from what followed. Because the case which I have come to think of as the matter of the vanishing bride began not in our rooms at Baker Street, nor in the study of some desperate client, but on the open platform at Farncombe Junction, where Holmes and I stood waiting for the 2:14 to Waterloo, and where, for a span of perhaps 3 minutes, nothing in England seemed capable of producing a mystery worth the name. We had spent 2 days in Surrey on a matter of so little consequence that I shall not trouble the reader with its particulars. Holmes had been engaged to examine a disputed signature on a tenancy agreement, the sort of work he accepted only when the alternative was idleness, and which he endured with the visible impatience of a man asked to tune a piano when he would rather compose a symphony. The consultation had concluded that morning. Holmes had pronounced his verdict over breakfast, collected his fee with an expression suggesting the sum itself was an insult, and spoken barely a dozen words since. He stood now at the platform's edge, his lean figure angled slightly into the wind, his gray eyes fixed on nothing I could identify. I had positioned myself on the single bench, my medical bag between my feet, my left shoulder held at the angle that had become habitual whenever the weather shifted between damp and dry. I believed myself unremarkable. Holmes, as ever, believed otherwise. "You might have mentioned it, Watson." I looked up. He had not turned. His voice carried the flat, diagnostic tone I had learned to associate with observations already completed and conclusions already drawn. "Mentioned what, precisely?" "The letter, the shoulder. The fact that you have spent the better part of this morning treating yourself rather than asking me to assist, which tells me the discomfort is not new but renewed, and that its renewal coincides with something you read before breakfast." Now he turned, and his gaze moved across me with the impersonal thoroughness of a man reading a column of figures. "You are holding your left shoulder approximately 1 inch higher than your right, not the habitual compensation I have observed for the past decade, but an acute elevation suggesting fresh inflammation. You have applied zinc ointment to the area yourself, evidenced by the faint smear visible just above your collar on the left side, deposited at an angle consistent with your own right hand reaching across your body rather than a second party's application. And in your breast pocket," he nodded toward my coat, There is a telegram folded not twice, as is customary for a single reading, but 3 times, which tells me you refolded it after your initial reading in order to reconsider its contents. A telegram one reads once is news. A telegram one refolds is trouble. I opened my mouth to object, found no grounds for objection, and closed it again. You received it at the inn this morning before I came down. You read it, you refolded it, and within the hour your shoulder had tightened to the point of requiring treatment. The body remembers what the mind attempts to suppress. I should judge that the telegram concerns someone from your military days, someone whose name alone is sufficient to return you, however briefly, to the particular tensions of that period. He paused. Murray, perhaps, or Ashworth. Murray, I admitted, and the name felt heavier for being spoken aloud. He is unwell. His wife wrote to me. She fears it is consumption. Holmes regarded me for a moment with an expression I could not easily classify, not sympathy, for he distrusted the word, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the slight softening of the lines around his mouth. He said nothing further. He did not need to. The deduction was complete, and the silence that followed it was, in its way, the closest thing to kindness Holmes permitted himself on a railway platform in Surrey. I was still composing a response when the sound of rapid footsteps broke across the quiet, leather soles on stone, uneven with haste, and both of us turned toward the figure approaching from the station house. The curate's account. He was a young man, not yet 30, I should have guessed, and he wore the black cassock of a Church of England clergyman with the particular gracelessness of someone who had dressed in extreme haste. 2 of the buttons at his chest were misaligned, each slotted one position too high, so that the fabric pulled unevenly across his narrow frame. His face was the color of candle wax. His hair, a reddish brown that might have been neatly parted an hour ago, stood in disordered tufts above his left ear, as though he had been clutching at it repeatedly. He carried no hat and no gloves, and a man of the cloth who leaves his house without both in an English village has either lost his reason or encountered something that has displaced it. He stopped 6 paces from us, breathing hard, and his eyes moved from me to Holmes and back again with the rapid, desperate calculation of a man searching for a lifeline. When his gaze settled on Holmes, something shifted in his expression, recognition or the hope of it. You are, forgive me, you are Mr. Sherlock Holmes? The words came in fragments, each separated by a small, involuntary breath. I saw your likeness in the Strand. The illustration, you are him. You must be him. Holmes inclined his head a fraction. I am. And you are a curate, recently ordained, if the newness of your stole is any guide, attached to a parish within walking distance of this station, which you left in such haste that you misbuttoned your cassock and forgot your biretta. You have been running. Your errand is not pastoral, or you would have composed yourself before approaching strangers. What has happened? The young man, he gave his name as the Reverend Mr. Arthur Tidwell, curate of St. Dunstan's in the village of Amnerley, did not so much answer the question as release it, the way a man releases a weight he has been carrying too long in silence. The words came unevenly, circling back upon themselves, repeating key details as if repetition might render them believable. A wedding. That morning, 11 o'clock, Miss Constance Radcliffe and Mr. Edwin Ashford. The church full, not large, 40 souls perhaps, but every pew occupied. The vicar, Mr. Pennock, conducting the service from the Book of Common Prayer. Everything proceeding as it ought. The bands read on 3 successive Sundays. The bride on the left, the groom on the right, precisely as prescribed. The congregation seated. The address completed. The vicar had asked the woman, "Wilt thou have this man?" And she had answered. She had said the words, "I will." Tidwell had heard her clearly. He had been standing not 4 feet away at the edge of the chancel. And then he stopped. He started again. He stopped. She was there, he said. She was there, and then she was not there, not gone through the door. The doors were behind the congregation, and no one passed through them, not collapsed. There was no sound, no cry, no falling. She was standing beside Mr. Ashford with her hand in his, and then she was simply absent, as if she had never been. The congregation did not see her leave. Mr. Ashford did not feel her hand withdraw. She was there, and then the space where she had been was empty, and the only thing that remained was the smell, this dreadful, sweet, lingering smell of orange blossom, though there were no orange blossoms in the church, none at all. His hands were shaking. He pressed them together as if in prayer, though I suspected the gesture was mechanical rather than devotional. Holmes had not moved throughout the account, but I had learned to read the stillness of his posture the way a sailor reads the surface of calm water, and what I read now was interest, acute, predatory, and absolute. "The hymn," Holmes said quietly. "Before the vows were exchanged, was a hymn sung?" Tidwell blinked. "Yes, lead us, Heavenly Father, lead us." The congregation stood for it. And the bride stood with them? Yes, she stood. And when the congregation sat again, she was gone. Tidwell's face seemed to collapse inward around the confirmation. "Yes." Holmes turned to me, and in his eyes I saw the thing I had witnessed perhaps a dozen times in our long association, the cold, bright ignition of a mind presented with a problem worthy of its machinery. He did not smile. The expression was more private than that, and more dangerous. "Watson," he said, "we shall not be taking the 2:14 to Waterloo." He was already moving toward the opposite platform, where the branch line ran south toward Amnerley. "Come, the next train departs in 11 minutes, and I should very much like to see a church from which a bride can vanish between one breath and the next." The village and the church. The branch line to Amnerley was a single-track affair that wound through low Surrey hills with the unhurried indifference of a river finding its course. The carriage was empty save for ourselves and Tidwell, who sat opposite with his hands clasped between his knees and his gaze fixed upon the floor. Holmes had taken the window seat and was watching the passing landscape with the focused absorption he reserved for data collection, cataloging distances, noting the position of roads relative to the railway, marking where a footpath crossed open ground. I knew better than to interrupt. When Holmes was reading a landscape, he was reading a story that the land itself did not know it was telling. The journey lasted a quarter of an hour. We alighted at a halt so modest it barely warranted the name. A single platform of packed earth, a wooden shelter with a bench, and a hand-painted sign that read Amnerley in letters the rain had softened to gray. A lane led from the halt through a corridor of budding hawthorn, and the air here was thick with the particular dampness of late April in the southern counties. Not cold, but laden, as if the season itself were holding its breath between winter's retreat and summer's reluctant advance. The earth in the fields to either side had been recently turned, and the smell of it, dark, organic, faintly metallic, mingled with the sweeter notes of wild garlic growing in the hedge bottoms. Amnerley itself emerged gradually rather than announcing itself. A scattering of cottages with moss-darkened thatch, a forge, cold and shuttered, a general shop with a cat asleep in the window. The Lamb and Anchor Inn, a timber-framed building of considerable age, standing at the junction where the lane met the village road. And beyond these, set upon a gentle rise at the village's northern edge, St. Dunstan's. I have seen many English churches in my time, and most share the quality of appearing to have grown from the ground rather than having been built upon it. St. Dunstan's was no exception. Its core was Norman, a squat, square tower of flint and rubble, the stonework darkened by 8 centuries of English weather to the color of old bone. The nave had been extended in the perpendicular period, its windows taller and more generous than the originals, and a Victorian vestry extension had been added to the north side, its brickwork still noticeably newer than the surrounding stone. The south porch, through which the congregation would have entered that morning, was shaded by a yew tree of enormous age, its trunk split and hollowed, but still producing the dark, poisonous foliage that has made the yew a fixture of English churchyards since before the Conquest. The lich gate was dressed for a wedding, or had been. White ribbon hung in limp loops from the oak crossbeam, and a garland of spring flowers, primroses, narcissi, and the pale, trembling bells of lily of the valley had been wound around the gateposts. But the flowers were already wilting in the damp air, their petals darkening at the edges, and the ribbon had begun to sag. No one had thought to remove them, and no one, it seemed, had thought to maintain them. They hung in that peculiar state of arrested celebration that is more melancholy than any deliberate mourning, joy interrupted, left to spoil. In the churchyard, perhaps a dozen figures stood in loose, uncertain clusters. The men had removed their top hats and held them at their sides, unsure whether the occasion still warranted formality. The women clutched shawls and spoke in lowered voices that carried across the graves as a continuous, indistinct murmur, the sound of a community attempting to process the incomprehensible through the only mechanism available to it, which is repetition. I caught fragments as we passed through the lich gate. Vanished. The poor girl, her mother's curse, never should have vanished. The word recurred like a bell struck and struck again. Holmes moved through them without acknowledgement, his attention fixed entirely upon the church itself. I followed, and as I did, I was struck, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, by the particular cruelty of joy that has been interrupted. Grief that arrives on schedule can be prepared for, armored against, endured. But happiness cut short in the very act of its consummation leaves a wound of a different character entirely, ragged, disbelieving, and slow to close. The flowers on the lich gate were not mourning Constance Radcliffe. They were mourning the moment that should have followed her vows, the moment that now would never exist, and their slow decay seemed to me a more eloquent expression of loss than any black crepe could have provided. We entered the church through the south porch, and the air inside was cool and still, and faintly, impossibly sweet. The groom who would not sit. The interior of St. Dunstan's was modest in the manner of parish churches that serve communities too small to require grandeur and too proud to tolerate neglect. The nave held perhaps 15 rows of oak pews, their surfaces darkened and smoothed by generations of hands. A central aisle, flagstoned in uneven squares of local sandstone, led from the porch to the chancel step, where a wrought iron rail separated the congregation's domain from the altar beyond. The windows were clear glass for the most part. The parish had evidently never possessed the funds for colored work, though a single lancet above the altar held a modest depiction of St. Dunstan himself, rendered in deep blues and ambers that cast faint jeweled patterns on the stone floor when the light was right. At this hour, in the gray overcast of an April afternoon, no such patterns were visible. The church was lit only by what seeped through the plain glass and by the remnants of candles in iron sconces along the walls, several of which still burned with the low, steady patience of flames that no one had thought to extinguish. The air held a sweetness that did not belong there, delicate, intrusive, unmistakably deliberate. I looked for its source and found none. There were flowers at the altar, white lilies in brass vases, their scent heavy but distinct from the citrus sweetness that overlaid it. No orange blossom anywhere, no bouquet left behind. And yet the fragrance was there, concentrated most heavily near the chancel rail, as if someone had uncorked a bottle of the stuff and poured it across the stones. Holmes registered the scent with a single sharp inhalation and said nothing. His attention had already moved past it. Edwin Ashford stood exactly where he had stood during the vows. He had not moved. His gloves were still on, his coat still fastened, his posture fixed as though movement itself might confirm what his mind refused to accept. He was not grieving. He was resisting reality. He was tall, an inch or two above 6 feet, and lean in the manner of men who work land rather than merely own it. His face was long, clean-shaven, weathered to a ruddy brown along the cheekbones, and just now it wore the expression I have seen on the faces of men pulled from collapsed trenches. Not grief, not shock, but a blank, absolute refusal to integrate the evidence of their own senses. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two beyond it. His eyes, when they met mine, were the pale blue of winter sky, and they held nothing. "Mr. Ashford," Holmes said, and his voice was careful in the way a surgeon's hands are careful, precise without gentleness, respectful of the wound without pretending it did not exist. "I am Sherlock Holmes. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson. The Reverend Mr. Tidwell has described the circumstances of this morning. I should like to examine the church, and I should like to ask you 3 questions. Will you permit both?" Ashford looked at Holmes as though the words had reached him from a considerable distance and required translation. Then he nodded once, with the mechanical obedience of a man operating on the last reserves of his composure. Holmes moved immediately to the chancel. I watched him work. It was, as always, an education. He did not begin with the obvious. He did not examine the altar or the rail or the spot where Constance had last been seen. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the chancel in a slow, deliberate circuit, his gaze moving across the floor, the walls, the ceiling, the junction of stone and wood at every point. He paused at the altar flowers and bent close enough to inhale their scent, confirming, I understood, that the lilies were not the source of the orange blossom. He examined the kneeling cushions, 2 of them, positioned side by side before the rail. One showed the impression of use, the velvet nap pressed flat in the shape of 2 knees. The other was untouched. The ceremony had not reached the point of kneeling. He studied the register book, open upon the vestry table just within the vestry door. The page dated, the names written in the vicar's hand, the spaces for signatures entirely blank. A marriage prepared for and never completed, arrested in ink. Then Holmes asked his 3 questions. "Mr. Ashford, first, the bridal veil. Was it worn forward, covering the bride's face, or pushed back upon her head?" Ashford's voice, when it came, was hoarse and flat. "Pushed back. She wore it behind. You could see her face. I could see her face." "Second, the lighting at the moment of the disappearance. Were the candles in the chancel lit? And if so, how many?" Ashford frowned, the question pulling him momentarily out of his stupefaction. 4, 2 on each side of the altar. The vicar lit them before the service. Third, was a hymn being sung at the precise moment you became aware that Miss Radcliffe was no longer beside you? This question struck something. Ashford's rigid posture shifted, not a collapse, but a fracture, a single crack running through the edifice of his control. "Yes," he said, and his voice dropped to nearly nothing. The congregation had stood for the hymn, "Lead us, Heavenly Father." She stood with them. I stood with her. Her hand was in mine. And when the hymn ended and we sat, I sat. She did not. She was not there. Her hand was not there. There was nothing there except the smell, that awful sweet smell, and the space where she had been, and I cannot. He stopped. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The sentence was the same one every man speaks when the world has subtracted something essential from his immediate reality without providing either explanation or warning. I cannot understand it. Holmes was quiet for a moment. Not the analytical silence I had observed on the platform. Something else. Something that acknowledged the scale of the thing before assigning it to the machinery of reason. Then he turned from Ashford and crossed the chancel to the vestry door. I followed his gaze downward. There, at the threshold where the chancel flagstones met the vestry step, a single stone sat fractionally lower than its neighbors. A difference of perhaps a quarter inch, invisible to anyone not looking for it, but sufficient to catch the toe of a careful man and the eye of an extraordinary one. The mortar along its edges was lighter than the surrounding grout, not new but disturbed. Someone had lifted this stone recently and set it back, and done so with enough care to escape casual notice, but not enough to escape Holmes. He knelt beside it. He ran one fingertip along the mortar line. He brought the finger to his nose and inhaled. Then he rose and said nothing, and his silence was louder than anything Ashford had told us. I asked him later that evening what he had smelled on that mortar. Earth, he said. Not church earth. Not the dry dust of a sealed floor. Living earth, damp, organic, recently exposed to air. That stone, Watson, has been lifted from above and replaced. What lies beneath it is a question I intend to answer, but not yet. Not until I understand who arranged for it to be opened, and why the scent of orange blossom was left behind like a visiting card from a ghost who does not exist. He would say no more. I stood in the nave of St. Dunstan's and watched the candles burn down toward their iron holders, and I thought of Constance Radcliffe's hand disappearing from her groom's grip like something drawn down through dark water, and I could not rid myself of the conviction that wherever she was not somewhere she had chosen to be. Chapter 2. What the Witnesses Saw. The Lamb and Anchor occupied the ground floor of a timber-framed building that had been old when the Stuarts were young. Its ceilings were low and blackened by generations of tobacco smoke, its floors uneven with the settled confidence of oak that has borne the weight of 4 centuries of boots, and its windows, small, diamond-paned, thick with the imperfections of hand-blown glass, admitted the outside world only grudgingly, as if the building itself preferred to keep its own counsel. Under ordinary circumstances, I imagine it was the kind of establishment that smelled of ale, damp wool, and the reassuring staleness of a room that has been in continuous use since the reign of Elizabeth. On this particular afternoon, it smelled of cold roast beef, warm sherry, and bewilderment. The wedding breakfast remained untouched. Cold meats stiffened on silver platters. Sherry glasses stood half-filled. A 3-tiered cake waited beneath its sugar roses, dignified and irrelevant. No one knew whether to sit or to leave. A celebration had been prepared. It no longer had a bride. No one was eating. The guests who had drifted here from the churchyard occupied the room in the manner of people waiting for permission to leave, clustered in 2s and 3s, speaking quietly, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to arrive and explain what had happened and, more importantly, what they were expected to do about it. The rituals of English social life are robust, but they contain no established protocol for a wedding reception at which the bride has ceased to exist. Holmes moved through the room with the selective attention of a man at an exhibition who has already identified the 3 paintings worth studying and is merely navigating past the rest. I followed, and as I did, I catalogued the figures who would, over the next several hours, become the principal witnesses in our inquiry. Mrs. Hartley sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, the bride's widowed aunt, and, as I would learn, her legal guardian since the death of Constance's mother 9 years prior. She was a woman of perhaps 55, handsome in a preserved, deliberate way, with gray hair pinned beneath a hat of dark blue velvet, and a mourning brooch at her throat that she wore, I suspected, less from grief than from habit. Her posture was impeccable. Her gloves, dove gray kid, buttoned to the wrist, were spotless, which struck me as remarkable for a woman who had supposedly spent the past 2 hours in the distress of a missing niece. She held a cup of tea that she had not touched, and her expression was one of dignified suffering so precisely calibrated that it might have been rehearsed. Beside her, standing rather than sitting, was Mr. Fentham, an elderly, thin-faced gentleman in a frock coat of conservative cut, whom Tidwell identified as the Radcliffe family's solicitor. He held his hat in both hands and turned it slowly, continuously, as if operating a device whose function he had forgotten. At the far end of the room, seated alone at a table meant for 8, was a young woman I took to be near Constance's own age. Slight, fair-haired, wearing the pale lavender dress of a bridesmaid. Her eyes were red, but dry. She sat with her hands flat on the tablecloth, pressing down, as if anchoring herself against a current only she could feel. This, I learned, was Miss Adelaide Driscoll, Constance's closest friend and the sole attendant at the ceremony. And near the door, making notes in a pocketbook, with the unhurried self-importance of a man who believes the situation to be beneath the full exercise of his authority, stood Sergeant Briggs of the local constabulary, a broad, florid man with ginger side whiskers who had already, I gathered from fragments of his conversation with the innkeeper, classified the entire affair as a case of bridal nerves and expected Miss Radcliffe to reappear by supper time with an apology and a blush. Holmes surveyed them all in a single sweeping evaluation that lasted no more than 5 seconds and contained, I have no doubt, more accurate assessment than the sergeant's pocketbook would accumulate in a week. "Watson," he said, his voice pitched for my ears alone, "I shall require the use of a private room. I wish to speak to each of them separately. A witness who performs for an audience tells you what they wish to be believed. A witness who speaks alone tells you what they are afraid of." The innkeeper, a Mr. Cobden, provided a small parlor off the main passage, furnished with a writing desk, 2 chairs, and a window that overlooked the churchyard. Holmes positioned himself behind the desk, not from authority, but from geometry. It placed the light from the window on the face of whoever sat opposite, while leaving his own features in partial shadow. I had seen him arrange interrogation spaces before. He constructed them the way an angler selects a stretch of river, with precise attention to where the current runs and where the fish are likely to surface. "Miss Driscoll first," he said, "the bridesmaid. She has been weeping, but she has stopped. A woman who has finished weeping is ready to speak clearly. A woman still weeping will tell you only about her tears." Miss Driscoll's testimony. Miss Adelaide Driscoll entered the parlor with the careful composure of a woman who has very recently decided that she will not cry again and is not yet entirely confident in the decision. She was younger than I had first judged, 22, perhaps 23, with a narrow, intelligent face and pale eyes that moved between Holmes and myself with the wary attentiveness of someone accustomed to being underestimated and alert to the possibility that she might not be. She sat in the chair Holmes indicated, arranged her hands in her lap, and waited. Holmes did not begin with the disappearance. This was characteristic. He understood that a witness who is asked immediately about the extraordinary event will give you the version they have already constructed, the narrative they have told themselves, polished and internally consistent, and stripped of the very details that matter most. Instead, he asked about the morning. "You dressed the bride," he said. It was not a question. "I did, at Amnerley Grange. We began at 8:30. Describe her state of mind." Miss Driscoll considered this with a precision I found admirable. She did not reach for the easy answer, happy, nervous, excited, but instead offered something more specific and therefore more useful. She was calm, not the calm of someone suppressing agitation. I have seen that, and it has a particular quality, a tightness about the mouth. This was different. Constance was settled. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice was steady. She stood still while I fastened her buttons. She looked at herself in the glass for a long time, but not with vanity. It was more as though she were confirming something. committing her own appearance to memory. An unusual observation, Holmes remarked. Constance is an unusual woman. She corrected herself, and the correction cost her. Constance is. Holmes allowed the silence its weight before continuing. During the dressing, or at any point in the morning before the ceremony, did anything occur that struck you as irregular? Any visitor, any communication, any change in the bride's demeanor, however slight? Here Miss Driscoll hesitated. It was a small hesitation, a fraction of a second in which her gaze dropped from Holmes's face to his hands and returned. But it was enough. Holmes saw it. I saw it. And Miss Driscoll, to her credit, saw that we had seen it. There was a note, she said, delivered to the house at breakfast, brought by a boy, I did not recognize him, from the direction of the village. It was on heavy paper, cream-colored, folded once and sealed with plain wax, no envelope. Constance took it, read it standing by the window, and then crossed the room and burned it in the grate. The whole thing, she did not tear it, did not keep a piece, she burned it completely. And you asked her about it? Of course I asked her. She said, Miss Driscoll paused, and I watched her reproduce the memory with the fidelity of someone to whom precise language matters. She said, a debt repaid, nothing more. I pressed her. She shook her head and asked me to finish pinning her veil. Her manner did not change. She did not seem frightened. If anything, she seemed resolved, as though the note had confirmed something she had already expected. Holmes leaned forward slightly. The movement was almost imperceptible, but I had long since learned that his body advanced toward information the way a compass needle swings toward north, involuntarily, inevitably. One further question, Miss Driscoll. The cameo brooch. Something shifted in the young woman's expression. Surprise, perhaps, that Holmes already knew about it. Her mother's brooch, yes. Constance insisted on wearing it. It was a shell cameo, set in gold, depicting Ariadne. Her mother wore it on her own wedding day. Constance pinned it at her throat, just above the collar of the dress. She was particular about its position. She adjusted it 3 times. And after the disappearance, it was found on the chancel floor, just to the left of where Constance had been standing. Found by whom? By the vicar, Mr. Pennock. He noticed it when the congregation began to move about, after the confusion. Describe its condition precisely. Miss Driscoll's brow furrowed. It was open, the clasp was open, and the brooch was lying face down on the flagstone. But the clasp itself was not broken. The pin was straight, the hinge intact. I examined it myself when Pennock brought it to me. I know that brooch well. I have helped Constance fasten it a dozen times. The clasp is strong. It does not come open on its own. It must be released deliberately. Then the brooch was not dropped, Holmes said. It was placed. Miss Driscoll stared at him. The color had risen in her cheeks. Not embarrassment, but the flush of a mind arriving at a conclusion it had been circling for hours without permission to land. Placed, she repeated. Yes, that is the word. It was placed there. But by whom? And why? If Constance removed it herself, she did so deliberately. In the middle of her own wedding, in front of 40 people, and not one of them saw her do it. Not one of them was watching her hands, Holmes replied. They were watching her face. They were standing for a hymn. And when a congregation stands and sings, Miss Driscoll, their eyes are on their hymnals or on the heavens, not on a bride's fingers working a clasp at her throat. He thanked her and she rose, steadier than when she had entered, though I could see in the set of her jaw that the steadiness was a decision rather than a state. She paused at the door. Mr. Holmes, is she alive? That, Holmes said, is the question I intend to answer. I do not intend to answer it with speculation. She left. The door closed. Holmes turned to me, and his eyes held the particular brightness I had come to associate not with certainty, but with the specific pleasure of a pattern beginning to emerge from noise. The brooch, Watson. An open clasp on an unbroken hinge. A cameo of Ariadne, the woman who provided the thread that led Theseus out of the labyrinth. Do you suppose Miss Radcliffe chose that brooch by accident? I had no answer, but the question lodged in my mind like a splinter, and it would remain there, sharp and insistent, long after we left that room. Mrs. Hartley entered the parlor as though she were arriving at a committee meeting for which she was slightly, but forgivably, late. She did not knock. She did not wait to be invited. She crossed the threshold with a measured tread, surveyed the room, selected the chair, and sat with the practiced economy of a woman who has spent her adult life occupying spaces that do not quite belong to her and making them appear, through sheer force of deportment, as if they do. She was, as I had noted in the main room, immaculately presented. Her traveling dress was dark gray, not black, which would have implied a death she presumably did not yet wish to acknowledge, and cut in the restrained, high-collared fashion that respectable women of her generation wore like armor against the impertinence of the world. The mourning brooch at her throat was jet, carved with a small wreath of forget-me-nots, and it caught the light from the window with a dull gleam that seemed almost deliberate, as if the jewelry itself wished to announce its owner's familiarity with loss. Her gloves were spotless, not a crease, not a smudge. For a woman whose niece had just vanished, her hands had touched remarkably little. I could not reconcile those gloves with 2 hours of genuine anguish, and the failure of that reconciliation sat uneasily in my mind throughout the interview. "Mr. Holmes," she began before he could speak, "I am grateful that you have taken an interest. My niece is a steady, sensible girl, not given to theatrics, and I wish to assure you from the outset that whatever has occurred this morning, it is not of Constance's choosing. She was committed to this marriage. She wished for it. The match was suitable in every respect." Holmes allowed this preamble to settle, the way one allows a stone to sink to the bottom of a pool, before observing what it has disturbed on the surface. "Suitable?" he repeated. "In what respects, specifically?" "In all respects. Mr. Ashford is a man of good family. He has managed the Radcliffe estate's tenancies for 3 years. He knows the land. He knows its people. His connection to the family is natural. The union was logical." I noticed that she spoke of the marriage as one might speak of a business merger, in terms of logic, suitability, and connection rather than affection, desire, or love. Holmes noticed it too, I am certain, but he did not press the point. He had other ground to cover. "Mrs. Hartley, I should like to ask about the estate itself, Amnerley Grange and its associated properties. What is the financial condition of the Radcliffe holdings?" The question landed precisely where Holmes had aimed it, and the effect was visible. Mrs. Hartley's composure did not break. It was too well constructed for that. But it stiffened, the way a wall stiffens when a crack runs through its foundation, and the masonry above compensates by pressing harder against itself. "The estate it has been through a period of difficulty," she said. Each word was selected with the caution of a woman crossing a frozen pond. "My brother-in-law, the late Mr. Radcliffe, made certain investments in his final years that did not produce the returns he anticipated. There are debts. The land itself is entailed. But the marriage would have resolved these matters. Mr. Ashford's own resources, while modest, would have been sufficient to stabilize an estate that is, if I understand you correctly, significantly encumbered. To provide a path forward, yes." Holmes studied her for a moment with the clinical attention he might give to a specimen beneath a magnifying lens, not unkindly but without any pretense that the examination was comfortable for its subject. "Mrs. Hartley, I must ask you a question that you will find impertinent, and I must ask you to answer it honestly, because the alternative is that I will find the answer myself, through less considerate means. Who benefits if Constance does not marry? The change was instantaneous and complete. The composure did not fracture. It solidified, hardening into something brittle and defensive, the particular rigidity of a person who has been asked the one question they had been hoping to avoid and must now construct an answer that conceals more than it reveals. No one benefits, she said. Her voice was level, but the rhythm had changed, faster, less measured, the words arriving with the clipped precision of sentences that have been prepared in advance. No one benefits from this, Mr. Holmes. The disappearance of my niece is a tragedy, not an opportunity. I resent the implication. I have made no implication, Holmes replied, his tone entirely neutral. I have asked a question of inheritance law. The two are not the same thing, though your response suggests you are aware they might be connected. Mrs. Hartley rose. It was not an abrupt motion. She was too disciplined for that. But it was decisive, the kind of rising that communicates an intention to leave without the vulgarity of actually saying so. I have told you what I know, Mr. Holmes. My niece was happy. The marriage was sound. I have no explanation for what occurred in that church, and I find this line of questioning both distressing and unhelpful. She left the room, and the air she left behind was colder than the air she had displaced upon entering. Holmes watched the door close and then turned to me with an expression I knew well, the look of a man who has learned precisely what he expected to learn and is troubled not by the information itself but by the ease with which it was confirmed. She is lying, Watson. Not about everything, she is too intelligent for that, but about something specific and something central. Her gloves told me as much before she opened her mouth. Her gloves? Spotless, pristine, after 2 hours in which her niece has vanished from a church. A woman in genuine distress reaches for things, clutches the back of a pew, grips a railing, presses her hands against a wall. A woman whose gloves remain spotless after 2 hours of crisis is a woman who has not been in crisis. She has been waiting. Outside the window, the light had begun to thicken. The afternoon was collapsing into an early dusk, gray and heavy, and the churchyard beyond was emptying as the last of the wedding guests drifted away into the village. Evening was coming, and with it the feeling, familiar from 100 investigations, but no less oppressive for its familiarity, that the answers we needed were receding into darkness at precisely the rate we were advancing toward them. Mr. Fentham was the last to sit in the parlor chair, and he sat in it as a man sits in the witness box of a court, upright, reluctant, and acutely aware that every word he speaks may be turned against him by forces he cannot control. He was older than I had first estimated, closer to 70 than 60, with the kind of face that had been angular in youth and had softened with age into something gaunt rather than gentle. His eyes were sharp behind small, wire-framed spectacles, and his hands, when not turning his hat, were clasped together on the desk before him with the white-knuckled discipline of a man determined to appear at ease and failing visibly. He had been the Radcliffe family's solicitor for over 30 years, he told us, had served Constance's grandfather, her father, and now Constance herself. He spoke of this long association with the particular blend of pride and defensiveness that characterizes professionals who have been loyal to a declining institution and fear that their loyalty may be reinterpreted as complicity. Holmes wasted no time on preamble. Mr. Fentham, I wish to understand the precise terms of the late Mr. Radcliffe's will as they pertain to his daughter's inheritance. I am particularly interested in any conditional provisions. Fentham removed his spectacles, cleaned them with a handkerchief, and replaced them. A delay of perhaps 8 seconds that was, I recognized, not optical maintenance, but the construction of a defense. When he spoke carefully, each clause delivered with the measured precision of a man who has spent his professional life among documents and knows that language, improperly handled, is more dangerous than any weapon. The late Mr. Harold Radcliffe, Constance's father, died in the spring of 1886. His will, which I drafted and witnessed, established the following provisions regarding the estate. Amnerley Grange, its grounds, tenanted farms, and all associated properties were settled upon his daughter, Constance Mary Radcliffe, as sole heir. The settlement was, however, conditional. Conditional upon what? Upon marriage. Fenton said the word as though it tasted of something unpleasant. Mr. Radcliffe was a man of traditional views. He believed with some firmness that a woman alone could not manage an estate of Amnerley's complexity. He stipulated in the will that Constance would inherit the full estate, without encumbrance, upon the solemnization of a lawful marriage. The inheritance was to vest upon the completion of the ceremony and the signing of the register. And if she did not marry? Fenton's reluctance had been evident from the moment he entered the room. Now it became something larger, a physical thing, almost palpable, pressing against the inside of his chest and making each breath an act of negotiation between professional duty and personal discomfort. If Constance failed to marry before her 25th birthday, he said, and each word arrived as though it had been extracted by forceps, the estate, all of it, the house, the land, the rents, would revert to the next male relative in the Radcliffe line. Holmes's stillness sharpened. And who is the next male relative? A distant cousin, Mr. Leonard Vane, the grandson of Mr. Radcliffe's uncle, Edward Vane Radcliffe, who, there was a family disagreement some decades ago. The branches separated. Leonard Vane has had no involvement with the estate for many years. He resides abroad. South Africa, I believe, the Cape Colony. And when does Constance turn 25? The question was quiet, but it filled the room the way cold air fills a space when a window is broken. Suddenly, completely, and with the immediate understanding that something has changed that cannot be unchanged. The 11th of May, Fenton said, 11 days from now. I felt the case restructure itself beneath me. What had been a mystery, strange, possibly supernatural, touched with the Gothic theatricality of a bride dissolving like mist, was suddenly, unmistakably, something else. Something mechanical, something calculated, something with a deadline. A woman had not vanished from a church. A woman had been removed from a legal process at the precise moment that the process would have rendered her the owner of a substantial property, and the removal had been timed with the exactitude of a man who understood that 11 days was not a margin, but a countdown. Holmes had not moved. His expression had not changed, but I knew with the certainty of a man who has watched his friend think for more than a decade, that behind the mask of stillness, every mechanism of that extraordinary mind was engaged, spinning, aligning. Mr. Fenton, Holmes said, one further question. Have you ever met Leonard Vane? The solicitor shook his head. I have not. All communication with Mr. Vane has been conducted by letter. He writes from Cape Town, quarterly, to inquire about the estate's condition. He has done so for approximately 8 years, since he departed England. I have never seen the man in person. And yet he stands to inherit a considerable property? If the conditions of the will are met, or rather, if they are not met. Holmes thanked him. Fenton rose, replaced his hat, and paused at the door in the manner of a man who wishes to add something but cannot determine whether the addition would be professional suicide or professional duty. In the end, he chose a middle course. Mr. Holmes, I drafted that will because my client instructed me to do so. I advised against the marriage condition. I told Harold Radcliffe that it was, in my professional opinion, an invitation to precisely the sort of complication that has now arisen. He did not listen. Men who believe they can govern from beyond the grave rarely do. He left. The room was quiet. Through the window, the last gray light of the April afternoon was dissolving into the deeper gray of evening, and the church tower rose against the darkening sky like a finger pressed to the lips of the village, counseling silence. I sat with the weight of what had been revealed settling over me, not quickly, but with the slow, heavy inevitability of sediment in still water. A vanishing reframed, not a miracle, not a haunting, not a bride taken by her mother's ghost, or spirited away by forces beyond human comprehension. Something far worse. Someone had studied the terms of a dead man's will, calculated the days remaining, identified the precise moment at which the inheritance would transfer, and arranged for the woman who stood to receive it to be removed from the ceremony with the precision of a chess piece lifted from the board at the critical move. Holmes stood at the window, his profile sharp against the fading light. He did not speak for a long time, and when he did, his voice was stripped of its usual clinical detachment. What remained was something harder, something that lived beneath the intellect, not anger quite, but its near relation. A vanishing, Watson, is a spectacle. It invites wonder. It provokes superstition. And while the village of Amnerley wonders and speculates about ghosts and curses, 11 days are passing. That is not a mystery. That is a mechanism. And mechanisms, unlike ghosts, have engineers. Chapter 3. The House on the Hill. The lane from the village to Amnerley Grange climbed through a darkness so complete that the boundaries between earth, hedge, and sky were erased. There was no moon. The overcast that had thickened throughout the afternoon had consolidated into a solid ceiling of cloud that pressed down upon the Surrey hills like the lid of a box, admitting neither starlight nor the faintest suggestion of depth. Our lantern, borrowed from the innkeeper, a battered tin affair with a tallow candle behind smoked glass, threw a circle of amber light no wider than a dining table, and beyond that circle, nothing. The world ended at the edge of the glow and began again with each step forward, assembling itself from darkness, one flagstone, one rut, one puddle at a time. Holmes walked ahead. He had not spoken since we left the inn, and his silence was of the variety I had learned, over many years, to distinguish from mere quiet. There is a silence that indicates absence of thought, and a silence that indicates such density of thought that language has been temporarily displaced as an inefficient vehicle. This was the latter. Holmes was constructing something, assembling the fragments of the afternoon's interviews into an architecture I could not yet perceive. And the outward sign of this construction was a complete stillness of expression and a pace that was fractionally faster than the terrain warranted, so that I found myself lengthening my stride to match his, and feeling, not for the first time, that I was following him not merely up a lane, but into a region of understanding that he had already entered, and I had not. The air was heavy with the smell of wet stone and bruised grass. Somewhere to our left, water ran. A ditch or a small stream, invisible in the darkness, its sound a continuous low murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. We passed the church. I could not see it, but I knew it was there by the change in the air, a faint current of cooler dampness that flowed from the direction of the churchyard, carrying with it the mineral smell of old masonry and the softer, sweeter note of cut grass. Someone had already removed the wedding flowers from the lich gate. I knew this because Holmes paused at the spot, held the lantern toward the gate, and the bare oak crossbeam gleamed wetly where the ribbons had been, stripped clean, as if the village had decided collectively and without discussion that the celebration had never occurred. Amnerley Grange materialized above us as we crested the hill, not all at once, but in pieces. First the chimneys, black against the slightly less black sky, then the roofline, irregular with the additions and modifications of 4 centuries, then the windows, all dark, save one. A single rectangle of amber light on the upper floor, steady and solitary, burning with the particular quality of a candle left in an empty room by someone who expects to return. The house was Elizabethan at its core. I could make out the shapes of mullioned windows and a central gable, even in the darkness. But Georgian wings had been added at some point, extending the structure to either side with the symmetrical confidence of an age that believed it could improve upon anything, including the past. The front entrance was shuttered and unlit. Holmes moved without hesitation to the side of the house, following a flagged path that led around to the servants' entrance at the rear. He knocked. 3 sharp, evenly spaced raps, and after a pause long enough to suggest internal debate, the door opened. The woman who admitted us was small, round-shouldered, and dressed in the plain black of a housekeeper. She held a candlestick in one hand and suspicion in every line of her face. Holmes presented his card. She read it, glanced at us both, and stepped aside with the reluctant efficiency of a woman who has decided that resistance would require more energy than compliance, and that her employer's affairs have already exceeded the boundaries of what she is paid to manage. We entered. The servants' passage was narrow, low-ceilinged, and smelled of beeswax, cold dripping, and the particular staleness of a house that has been cleaned meticulously but not aired. The flagstones beneath our feet were worn smooth. The walls were whitewashed. Everything was in order, and the order itself felt like a form of denial, as if the house were insisting, through the discipline of its surfaces, that nothing extraordinary had happened within its walls. The housekeeper led us up the back stairs, a narrow, winding passage meant for servants' feet, not guests, and along a corridor that connected the older wing of the house to the newer. The transition was palpable. The floorboards changed from wide, irregular oak to narrower, more uniform pine, and the ceiling rose by several inches as we crossed from the Elizabethan core into the Georgian addition. The housekeeper stopped before a door on the upper floor and produced a key from the ring at her waist. "Miss Constance's room," she said, in a tone that made clear she considered our presence an intrusion, and the keys turning a concession she would not soon forgive. "Nothing has been touched. Mrs. Hartley's orders." She opened the door and retreated. Holmes entered first. I followed, and what I found was a room that told 2 stories simultaneously, one of the morning that had been, and one of the evening that had been anticipated and would now never arrive. The room was large by the standards of a country house bedroom, with a high ceiling and 2 tall windows that would, in daylight, have overlooked the gardens to the south. The furnishings were good but not extravagant. A brass bedstead, a wardrobe of dark mahogany, a washstand with a china basin, a dressing table with a triple-hinged mirror. The bed was made, turned down that morning by a housemaid who expected her mistress to sleep elsewhere that night. A nightgown lay folded on the pillow, redundant. It was the traveling trunk that arrested my attention first. It stood at the foot of the bed, a substantial piece of brown leather with brass fittings, buckled and labeled. The label, in a clear feminine hand, read, "Mrs. E. Ashford, the Royal Hotel, Sidmouth, Devon. A honeymoon. Planned, packed for, addressed." I stared at that label and felt the particular weight of a future that had been imagined in specific detail and then erased. Not gradually, not through the slow attrition of disappointment, but in a single instant, between one heartbeat and the next, between "I will" and silence. Holmes ignored the trunk. He went directly to the fireplace. The grate was cold, but not empty. A mound of fine gray ash sat upon the iron bars, the remains of paper recently burned. Holmes knelt before it and produced from his coat pocket the small magnifying lens he carried as other men carry a watch. He examined the ash with the delicacy of an archaeologist sifting through the remnants of an ancient text, his fingers hovering above the surface, never quite touching, moving the lens in slow, systematic passes. "One sheet," he said. "Heavy stock, high rag content. This is not common writing paper. The ash has held its shape in places. And here..." He reached into the grate with a pair of tweezers he produced from the same pocket. Holmes's coat was less a garment than a portable laboratory, and extracted a fragment no larger than a postage stamp. It was charred at the edges but intact at its center, and it bore, in the lower right corner, the ghost of a watermark, a partial design, cut off by the burning, showing what appeared to be the upper curve of a letter. a flourished V perhaps, or the arch of a decorative border. He placed the fragment in a small envelope and sealed it without comment. Then he turned to the writing desk. It was a lady's writing desk of the sort common in well-appointed bedrooms, a slant-topped affair in walnut, with a leather writing surface and a row of small compartments for ink, pens, sealing wax, and correspondence. Holmes opened it, examined each compartment, removed and replaced several items, a stick of red wax, a bundle of blank correspondence cards, a pen wiper embroidered with violets, and then paused. His fingers had found something at the rear of the desk's interior. He pressed, and a narrow drawer slid forward from what had appeared to be a solid panel, a hidden compartment cleverly fitted into the desk's construction, its seam invisible unless one knew precisely where to apply pressure. The drawer was empty, completely, conspicuously empty, not dusty, not disused, but emptied. The velvet lining showed the faint impression of objects recently removed, a rectangular shape, perhaps a packet of letters, and beside it, a smaller, squarer impression that might have been a photograph or a folded document. Emptied, Holmes said, but not this morning. Observe the dust pattern on the desk's surface compared to the interior of this compartment. The desk has not been cleaned in 3 days. There is a fine layer of household dust on the slant top. But the compartment's lining shows no dust at all. It was emptied recently, yes, but before the dust had time to accumulate again. I should say the contents were removed at least a fortnight ago, perhaps longer. He closed the compartment and straightened. His gaze moved to the wall above the mantelpiece, where a portrait hung in an oval gilt frame. I had noticed it upon entering, but not studied it. Now I did, and the woman who looked back at me from the canvas compelled a longer examination than I had anticipated. She was young, painted, I judged, in her late 20s, with dark hair dressed in the fashion of the 1870s, and a face that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the descriptions I had heard of Constance. The same strong jaw, the same direct gaze. But the expression was what held me. It was not the placid, softened countenance that Victorian portraiture typically imposed upon its female subjects. There was no gentle half-smile, no downcast modesty. The woman in the portrait looked directly outward with an expression I could only describe as resignation, the look of someone who has understood something unpleasant about her circumstances and has decided to endure it without the comfort of pretending it is otherwise. The late Mrs. Radcliffe, Constance's mother, dead 9 years. Holmes studied the portrait, then studied the frame. He tilted it forward from the wall, examined the backing, and then ran his fingertips along the gilt border. He stopped at the lower right corner. "Watson, come here." I approached. He indicated a series of fine scratches in the gilding, 4 parallel lines, shallow but deliberate, scored into the soft gold leaf with something pointed. Not damage, not accidental wear. A mark made intentionally, in a location that would not be noticed unless one were specifically examining the frame's surface. "Tally marks," I said. "Or a message. 4 lines, 4 letters, 4 something, made by someone with access to this room and reason to mark this frame in particular." He released the portrait and stepped back. "Constance Radcliffe has been preparing for something, Watson. The hidden compartment was emptied weeks ago. The desk has not been cleaned since. She received letters on heavy paper and burned every one. And on her mother's portrait, she, or someone, has left a mark that no one was meant to find." He looked at me, and what I saw in his face was not excitement, but gravity. The expression of a man who has realized that the problem before him is not merely a puzzle to be solved, but a trap that has already been sprung. And the question is no longer how it works, but whether its victim is still alive within it. "Someone has been preparing," he said again, as if the repetition might sharpen the blade of the observation. "The question is whether it was Constance preparing to escape or someone else preparing to take her." The servants' corridor. Holmes insisted on seeing the servants' quarters. The housekeeper had retired for the evening, having made clear through the geometry of her disapproval that she considered her obligations discharged, but the back stairs were not locked and Holmes required no guide. He moved through the house with the particular confidence of a man who understands the grammar of domestic architecture, where the servants' passages run parallel to the family corridors, where the back stairs connect kitchen to bedrooms, where the invisible infrastructure of a household's daily operation is hidden behind baize doors and whitewashed walls so that the family need never see the machinery that sustains their comfort. The servants' corridor on the upper floor was narrow and unadorned. 4 doors opened onto it, each fitted with a plain iron latch. The first 3 rooms were dark and silent, occupied, presumably, by staff already asleep or absent for the evening. The 4th was lit. A thin line of candlelight showed beneath the door, and from within came a sound I recognized at once, the particular hitching rhythm of someone weeping who has been weeping for some time and has passed beyond the stage of tears into the dry, exhausted convulsions that follow. I knocked gently. The weeping stopped, replaced by a silence more eloquent than any answer. "My name is Dr. Watson," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "I am here with Mr. Sherlock Holmes. We are investigating Miss Radcliffe's disappearance. We mean no intrusion, but if you are willing to speak, we should be very grateful." A pause. Then the latch lifted from within, and the door opened to reveal a young woman of perhaps 19 or 20, small and dark-haired, wearing the gray cotton dress and white apron of a housemaid. Her face was blotched and swollen with crying, her eyes red-rimmed, her cap askew. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a weight alone and has encountered unexpectedly the possibility of setting it down. "I'm Molly, sir," she said. "Molly Tanner. I'm Miss Constance's maid." Holmes remained in the corridor, deliberately, I believe, understanding that a young woman in distress would speak more readily to a doctor's gentle inquiry than to a detective's direct examination. I entered the small, spare room and sat on the only chair. Molly sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron into knots she did not seem aware she was making. I asked her about Constance. She answered not with the hesitant, reluctant fragments I had expected, but with a rush of words that suggested she had been waiting all day for someone to ask. Someone who was not Mrs. Hartley, not the sergeant, not any of the figures of authority who had spent the afternoon treating the disappearance as either a social embarrassment or a bureaucratic inconvenience. "She's been getting letters, sir, for months, 3 months, maybe 4. Always the same kind, heavy paper, cream-colored, folded and sealed with plain wax. No postmark, hand-delivered every time by a boy from the railway inn. Different boys, sometimes, but always from the inn. Miss Constance would read them in her room alone and then burn them straight away. Everyone. I empty the grates, sir. I know what burned paper looks like. She burned every single one." "Did she ever speak to you about them?" "No, sir, not a word. And I didn't ask. It wasn't my place. But I could see she was different after they started coming. Not frightened exactly, more like careful, like she was walking through a room with something fragile on every surface, and she couldn't afford to bump into anything. She was thinking all the time. You could see it. Her eyes would go somewhere else, even when she was talking to you." Holmes's voice came from the corridor, quiet but distinct. "Miss Tanner, did you ever observe any disagreement between Miss Radcliffe and Mrs. Hartley?" Molly's hands went still in her lap. The twisting stopped. She looked toward the doorway where Holmes stood in shadow, and something in her face changed. Not fear, but the particular caution of a servant who understands that speaking honestly about her employer's household carries risks that extend well beyond the current conversation. "3 weeks ago," she said, and her voice dropped almost to nothing. "It was evening. I was in the corridor. This corridor, just outside Mrs. Hartley's room. I wasn't listening. I was bringing the hot water for the washstand. But the door was open, not all the way, just a crack, and I heard them. Miss Constance and Mrs. Hartley. They were arguing. Mrs. Hartley was talking about the arrangement. That was the word she used. The arrangement. And Miss Constance said, I remember exactly because it frightened me. She said, I will not be sold, Aunt. Not by you, not by anyone. She paused. Her hands resumed their twisting. And then I heard it. The sound, a slap, an open hand, hard. And then nothing, no cry, no shouting, just silence. I went back to the stairs. I didn't bring the water. I couldn't. I was shaking too hard. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind had risen slightly, and a branch of something, ivy perhaps, or an unpruned rose, tapped against the window glass with irregular, insistent rhythm. One more question, Miss Tanner, Holmes said. Have you ever heard Mrs. Hartley speak the name Leonard Vane? Molly looked up. Once, she said. That same night, after Miss Constance had gone back to her own room. I was on the back stairs. I couldn't sleep. I was still upset. And I heard Mrs. Hartley through the door. She was talking to herself, or, no, she was talking to someone. But there was no one else there. No one had come in. She was reading something, I think. A letter, maybe. And she said the name, Leonard Vane. She said it like... She struggled for the word. Like what, Miss Tanner? Like she was asking him for something, sir, like she was pleading. The tapping of the branch against the window filled the silence that followed. Holmes stepped forward into the light, and I saw in his face the expression I had learned to associate with the moment a hypothesis ceases to be theoretical and becomes structural. The moment when the shape of the thing reveals itself, and what remains is merely the work of proving what is already, to his mind, known. He opened his mouth to speak, but before the first word could form, a sound reached us from below. 3 sharp knocks on the front door of Amnerley Grange, heavy and deliberate, the kind of knocking that does not request entry but announces it. Sergeant Briggs stood on the front step with his helmet under one arm and a lantern in his free hand, and the expression on his florid face had undergone a transformation since the afternoon. The comfortable self-assurance of a man managing a domestic trifle had been replaced by something raw. The look of a constabulary officer who has been presented with evidence that his initial assessment was wrong and is not yet certain how wrong, only that the wrongness is sufficient to have brought him out on a dark evening to a house he would rather not have visited. Mr. Holmes, he said, and the name carried the grudging deference of a man who is about to admit he needs help and resents the admission. A word, if you please. We assembled in the front hall, Holmes, myself, and Briggs, the housekeeper hovering at the edge of the lamplight with the vigilant displeasure of a woman whose household has been invaded by events she considers beneath its dignity. Briggs removed a folded cloth from beneath his cape and laid it on the hall table. He unwrapped it with the deliberate, thick-fingered care of a man handling something he does not fully understand, but suspects is important. Inside the cloth was a bridal veil, or rather, what remained of one. The fabric was fine white tulle, French net, the kind used for wedding veils of quality, and it was damp, stained with the dark, organic residue of river water, and snagged in several places where it had caught and torn. But it was the edge that commanded attention. One side of the veil was ragged, frayed, torn by force against the iron railing where it had been found. The other side, the opposite edge, was clean, not torn, not frayed, cut. A straight line, sharp and deliberate, made by a blade. Found it an hour ago, Briggs said. Snagged on the railings at the Amnerley Mill Weir, half a mile downstream from the church. One of the mill hands spotted it when he went to close the sluice gate for the night. The current runs from the church meadow down through the Amnerley Brook to the weir. If a person were to enter the water near the church, or near the footbridge behind the churchyard, anything they were wearing would follow the current to the weir within the hour. He let the implications settle. He did not state it outright. He did not need to. The veil at the weir, the bride missing from the church, the water between the two. The inference was as obvious as it was intended to be, and I felt it land in my chest with a weight that was part dread and part fury, because I understood, even before Holmes spoke, that the inference was precisely what someone had designed it to be. Holmes examined the veil without touching it. He bent over the hall table, his lens in his hand, and traced the line of the cut edge with a focus so absolute that the rest of us, Briggs, the housekeeper, myself, ceased to exist for him. He spent perhaps 90 seconds on the examination. When he straightened, his face was hard. "Sergeant, the current in the Amnerley Brook, it runs south to north? Southwest to northeast, roughly, from the higher ground near the church down to the mill. And the railing at the weir, the veil was snagged on the upstream side or the downstream?" Briggs frowned. "Upstream. Caught on the top rail, as if it had been carried against it by the water." "Carried against it?" "Yes. Now observe this edge." Holmes indicated the clean line without touching it. "This was not torn by current or by iron. This was cut with a sharp instrument, a knife or a pair of shears. The fibers are severed cleanly. There is no fraying, no stretching. This veil was cut before it entered the water, Sergeant, not after. And it was placed on the railing rather than carried there, because a piece of tool this light, carried by a brook current of the velocity you describe, would wrap around the first obstacle it encountered, a root, a branch, a stone, long before it reached the weir. It would not travel half a mile through moving water and arrive intact enough to snag cleanly on a railing. Someone cut this veil, walked to the weir, and placed it there." Briggs opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. "Placed it? You mean—" "I mean that someone wishes you to conclude that Constance Radcliffe walked from the church to the brook, entered the water, and drowned. The veil is not evidence of death, Sergeant. It is a theatrical property. It is the scenery of a stage play written for your benefit, designed to end your investigation before it begins." The silence that followed was of the particular quality that fills a room when an uncomfortable truth has been spoken, and no one present has the means to refute it. Briggs stared at the veil. The housekeeper retreated a step, as if the fabric itself had become contaminated by the suggestion of deliberate malice. I stood and felt the dread I had been holding at bay since Tidwell's account on the railway platform crystallize into something colder and more specific. Not the fear that Constance Radcliffe was dead, but the fear that someone very much wanted us to believe she was. "Is she alive, Mr. Holmes?" I asked. I could not help it. The question had been pressing against my teeth for hours, and the sight of that veil, that sad, sodden, calculated prop, forced it out. Holmes looked at me, and what I saw in his face was not reassurance. It was something rarer and more troubling, uncertainty held in check by determination. "I believe, Watson, that someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that question cannot be easily answered. The veil says she is dead. The brooch says she is not. The first was placed by an enemy. The second was placed, I think, by Constance herself. The question is which message we trust, and how much time we have before the distinction ceases to matter." We returned to the Lamb and Anchor in silence. Briggs walked with us as far as the village road, then departed toward the constabulary house with the veil wrapped in its cloth, and the look of a man whose evening has taken a turn he lacks the professional vocabulary to describe. Holmes went directly to our room and stood at the window, looking out at nothing, at the darkness, at the church tower invisible against the sky, at whatever architecture of logic was assembling itself behind his eyes. I lay in my bed that night and did not sleep. The room was cold, despite the small fire the innkeeper had laid, and the wind outside had strengthened, driving rain against the window in intermittent gusts that sounded in the darkness like handfuls of gravel thrown by an unseen hand. I thought of Constance Radcliffe. I thought of her standing at the chancel rail in her white dress, saying the words, "I will," to a future she had chosen, and then ceasing to exist, dissolving between one breath and the next, like morning frost when the sun finds it. And I thought of the orange blossom, that sweet, persistent, sourceless fragrance, hanging in the empty air where she had been, as if the only thing left of her was a scent, and the scent itself was fading. Chapter 4. The Absent Cousin. I woke to an empty room and a silence that felt deliberate. The rain had stopped. The wind had died. Through the window, the April morning presented itself in shades of gray and pale green, a washed-out sky, damp rooftops, and the distant fields emerging from mist with the slow reluctance of a landscape that would rather not be seen. Holmes's bed had been slept in, or at least occupied, for whether Holmes actually sleeps during an active investigation is a question I have never satisfactorily resolved. The covers were turned back, the pillow bore the impression of his head, and on the deal table between our beds, weighed down by an empty teacup, lay a note in his sharp, angular hand. Watson. Dispatched 3 telegrams before 6 o'clock. Gone to the church. Do not follow. Eat something. S.H. The instruction to eat was characteristic. Holmes's periodic acknowledgments that I was a biological organism, subject to requirements he himself seemed able to suspend at will. I went down to the common room, where the innkeeper's wife provided bread, cold ham, and a pot of strong tea, and I ate alone at a table by the window, watching the village come to life around me. A carter passed with a load of hurdles. 2 women in shawls walked toward the general shop, their voices carrying across the wet street in fragments I could not decipher. A boy drove a small herd of geese along the verge. Amnerly was performing the rituals of an ordinary morning, and the performance itself seemed like an act of defiance against the extraordinary thing that had happened within its boundaries the day before. Holmes returned at 10:15. He entered the inn through the rear door, his boots muddy to the ankle, his coat spotted with rain from the hedgerows, and his face lit with the particular energy that I had learned to associate not with triumph, but with confirmation, the satisfaction of a hypothesis tested against physical evidence and found sound. "You have been to the church," I said. "I have, at first light." The vicar was good enough to admit me, though I suspect he would have preferred to pretend I did not exist. I returned to the flagstone Watson, the one near the vestry door that sat lower than its fellows. He pulled a chair to the table, declined the tea I offered, and spoke with the rapid, compressed fluency he used when transmitting facts rather than constructing arguments. "The stone is sandstone, matching the others, but the mortar surrounding it is of 2 distinct ages. The original pointing, lime-based, friable, consistent with 17th or 18th century work, is visible on the eastern and southern edges. But the northern and western edges show a newer compound. Portland cement mixed with sand, applied within the last 4 to 6 weeks. Someone lifted that stone, accessed what lies beneath, and replaced it using modern materials to ensure a tighter seal. And what lies beneath? Steps, narrow stone, curving downward. I could not follow them far. I had no adequate light and no desire to alert the vicar to the full scope of my interest. But I descended 7 steps before the passage turned, and at the turn I felt a draft. A draft, Watson, in what should be a sealed crypt. Air was moving, which means the passage connects to another opening, somewhere beyond the church, below ground, in a direction I could not yet determine. He leaned forward. His eyes were bright, not with excitement, but with the controlled urgency of a man who understands that a problem has become a race. I also dispatched 3 telegrams this morning. The first to Langdale Pike, requesting any London intelligence on a man named Leonard Vane, physical description, known associates, current address if obtainable. The second to the Peninsula and Oriental Steam Navigation Company's offices at Leadenhall Street, requesting passenger manifests for all departures from and arrivals to English ports under the name Vane within the past 24 months. The third to the Colonial Office, requesting confirmation of whether a Leonard Vane is registered as a resident British subject in the Cape Colony. You suspect Vane is not in South Africa. I suspect, Watson, that a man who stands to inherit a valuable estate if a single condition is met, the failure of a marriage within a fixed period, would not entrust the fulfillment of that condition to chance while sitting comfortably in Cape Town. I suspect he would want to be closer, much closer. Holmes stood. We must find Leonard Vane, and to find him, we must first understand him. Come. Mr. Fentham's office is in Godalming, and the morning train leaves in 20 minutes. Fentham's office occupied the first floor of a narrow brick building on Godalming High Street, wedged between a draper's shop and a stationer's, and accessible by a steep staircase that smelled of old carpet and furniture polish. The door bore a brass plate, Fentham and Lewis, solicitors. Though Holmes had established the previous evening that Mr. Lewis had been dead for 11 years, and the partnership existed now in name only, sustained by inertia and the reluctance of an aging practitioner to acknowledge that his firm had become a solitary practice. Fentham received us in a room so densely furnished with legal documentation that the walls were barely visible behind stacked deed boxes, bound case files, and shelves of leather volumes whose spines bore dates rather than titles. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and the particular acrid sweetness of ink that has been drying in glass bottles for longer than is advisable. Fentham himself sat behind a desk that was less a writing surface than a geological formation. Layers of correspondence, conveyancing documents, and memoranda accumulated over decades and compressed by the weight of subsequent deposits into a stratum from which any individual document could be extracted only by an act of archaeological determination. Holmes did not waste the man's time or his own. Mr. Fentham, I wish to see Leonard Vane's correspondence. Every letter he has sent you from the Cape Colony, every communication you have received from him since his departure from England. Fentham hesitated. The same reluctance I had observed the previous evening, the professional caution of a solicitor who understands that producing a client's correspondence for a private detective occupies uncertain legal ground. But Holmes's expression did not invite deliberation, and Fentham, whatever his reservations, was a man who had spent 30 years serving the Radcliffe family and could not easily refuse an inquiry conducted in its interest. He rose, crossed to a deed box on the far shelf, and returned with a bundle of letters tied with red legal tape. There were perhaps 15 in total, spanning several years, each on the same heavy cream paper, each written in a neat, controlled hand, each bearing a Cape Town address in the upper right corner and a date at quarterly intervals. Holmes took the bundle, untied the tape, and examined the first letter with his lens, then the second, then the third. He did not read the contents. Not yet. He was reading the paper itself. Watson, he said after a moment, the fragment we recovered from Constance Radcliffe's grate. You have it? I did. Holmes had entrusted it to me the previous evening, sealed in its small envelope. I produced it. He held it beside the letter in his left hand, positioning both under the light from the office window, and tilted them until the watermarks were visible. Faint, ghostly impressions within the paper's weave, visible only when the light struck at the correct angle. The match was immediate and unmistakable. The partial watermark on the burned fragment, the curved flourish I had tentatively identified as a letter V, aligned precisely with the full watermark on Vane's correspondence. It was a manufacturer's mark, the monogram of a high-quality paper mill, distinctive enough to constitute identification and consistent enough across both samples to eliminate coincidence. The letters Constance received and burned were written on the same paper as Leonard Vane's correspondence to this office, Holmes said. Either Vane himself was writing to her, or someone with access to his stationery was doing so in his name. Fentham had gone very still behind his desk. The color had receded from his face in the manner of a man watching a structure he has built. A professional understanding, a set of assumptions about the orderly conduct of his client's affairs, begin to collapse from within. "Mr. Fentham," Holmes continued, his voice carrying the careful precision of a surgeon who has located the source of infection and must now decide how deeply to cut. "You told me yesterday that all communication with Leonard Vane has been conducted by letter, that you have never met him in person, that he departed England 8 years ago." "That is correct." "Have you ever verified his presence in the Cape Colony by any means other than his own letters?" The silence that followed was not an absence of sound, but a presence. The sound of a certainty being dismantled. Fentham opened his mouth, closed it, and looked down at the letters on his desk as though they had transformed into something unfamiliar and faintly dangerous. "I have not," he said. "I had no reason to doubt. A man writes to you from Cape Town, quarterly, on fine paper, in a careful hand, asking about the condition of an estate he stands to inherit if a young woman fails to marry before her 25th birthday. He has done this for 8 years. He has never visited. He has never sent an agent. He has never engaged a local solicitor to inspect the property on his behalf. Does that strike you, Mr. Fentham, as a man of the law, accustomed to evaluating the behavior of interested parties? Does that strike you as the conduct of a man who is content to wait on the far side of the world for an outcome of considerable financial consequence?" Fentham said nothing. His hands, flat on the desk, had begun to tremble. "It strikes me," Holmes said, rising and gathering the letters, "as the conduct of a man who wishes to appear absent. And a man who wishes to appear absent is, in my experience, almost invariably present, merely hidden. I believe Leonard Vane is not in South Africa, Mr. Fentham. I believe he has not been in South Africa for some considerable time, and I believe he has been a great deal closer to Amnerley than anyone in this village suspects." We left Fentham's office with the letters and returned to the station. Holmes was silent on the platform, but it was the silence of velocity rather than contemplation, the silence of a mind that has stopped gathering and started moving, driven by the particular urgency of a man who understands that the answer he is pursuing may arrive too late to matter. We found Edwin Ashford at the Lamb and Anchor, though the man who met us in the common room bore only a passing resemblance to the rigid, immaculate figure who had stood at the chancel rail the previous afternoon. He had not shaved. His morning coat had been replaced by a plain tweed jacket, creased where he had slept in it, or attempted to sleep, for his face carried the hollowed, bruised-eyed look of a man who has spent the night in a chair, staring at a wall, waiting for a knock at the door that did not come. He sat at a corner table with a cup of tea he had not touched, and a plate of bread he had not broken, and when Holmes sat down across from him, Ashford looked up with the expression of a man who has passed through shock and emerged on the other side into something quieter and more terrible. The calm, blank patience of someone who has accepted that the worst may already have happened and is simply waiting to be told. Holmes did not ease into the conversation. He understood, better I think than most people credited, that a man in Ashford's state is not served by gentle circumlocution. Directness, however painful, is a form of respect. It acknowledges that the person before you is capable of bearing the truth. "Mr. Ashford, did you know about the inheritance clause in the late Mr. Radcliffe's will?" Ashford's hands, wrapped around the cold teacup, tightened fractionally. "Yes. How long have you known?" 3 months. Constance told me in January. She said she wanted me to understand the full situation before the wedding. She said I deserved to know what the marriage meant beyond ourselves. And what did it mean? Ashford looked down at his tea. The surface was still, gray, cold, a mirror of nothing. It meant the estate, the house, the land, the tenancies. If she married before the 11th of May, everything was hers. If she did not, it went to a cousin she had never met, a man named Vane. And the marriage? Whose idea was it? Here Ashford's composure shifted. Not a collapse. The man was too controlled for that, too accustomed to the discipline of managing other people's land and other people's expectations. But a fracture, a single crack running through the facade of practical endurance he had maintained since the church. He released the teacup and pressed his palms flat on the table. And when he spoke, his voice was low and stripped of everything except the particular, devastating honesty of a man who has nothing left to protect. Hers. The marriage was Constance's idea. She came to me in November. There was an understanding between us of a sort. I had admired her for 2 years. She knew it, but she had never encouraged it, never reciprocated in any way I could point to. And then in November she came to my office at the estate and said very calmly, very clearly, that she wished to marry me, that the estate required it, that she was fond of me, and that fondness, combined with practical necessity, was a sufficient foundation. He paused. The word fond hung in the air between us, and I heard in it the quiet devastation of a man who loved a woman, and had been offered, in return, a word that fell short of love by exactly the distance between happiness and mere contentment. I accepted, he said, because I loved her, and because I told myself that fondness might deepen. That was my vanity, Mr. Holmes, my particular weakness. I believed that time and proximity would accomplish what her heart had not. Holmes was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice held something I rarely heard in it, not sympathy, which Holmes distrusted as an imprecise emotion, but acknowledgement. A recognition that the man before him had been honest in a way that cost him, and that the cost deserved to be met with equivalent directness. Mr. Ashford, 2 nights before the wedding, did Constance say anything to you? Anything unusual? Anything that suggested she was aware of a threat to the marriage? Ashford's face changed. The crack widened. She came to see me, at the lodge. It was late, past 9. She should not have been out alone, and she knew it, and she came anyway. She stood in the doorway. She would not come inside. She said it would not be proper, which was so like Constance, to worry about propriety while the ground was falling away beneath her. And she said, "Someone is trying to prevent this marriage, Edwin, and they may succeed." Did she say who? I asked. She shook her head. She said, "I do not know who. I know only that the letters have become more insistent, and the tone has changed. Whoever it is, they believe they have a right to this. And people who believe they have a right to something will go further than people who merely want it." Holmes absorbed this. His expression did not change, but I saw his right hand, resting on the table, close slowly into a fist, and then release, a gesture so small and so controlled that I doubt Ashford noticed it. I noticed it because I had seen it before, rarely, in moments when Holmes's intellectual engagement with a case was joined by something else, something less clinical and more human. "One more question, Mr. Ashford." Holmes leaned forward and spoke a single sentence. He spoke it quietly, so quietly that I, sitting beside him, caught only fragments. A name, a direction, a question framed in terms I could not reconstruct. But I saw its effect. Ashford's face, already drained of color, went white. The absolute bloodless white of a man who has been told something that rearranges everything he believed about his own situation, and the rearrangement is not an improvement. He did not answer. He nodded, once, and his nod had the quality of a man confirming something he had feared, but had lacked the courage to investigate. Holmes rose, thanked him, and walked toward the door. I followed, glancing back once at Ashford. who remained at the table with his cold tea and his untouched bread, and an expression that I have seen only on the faces of men who have realized, too late, that they were not participants in their own story, but instruments in someone else's. I asked Holmes as we crossed the inn yard what he had whispered. He shook his head. Not yet, Watson. I need the telegrams first. If they confirm what I now believe, I will tell you everything. If they do not, I will have given a good man unnecessary pain, and that is a debt I would rather not incur. The telegrams arrived in the early afternoon, delivered to the inn by a boy from the post office who seemed entirely unaware that the 3 slips of paper he carried in his satchel were about to collapse the distance between a man in South Africa and a house in Surrey to nothing. Holmes read them standing at the window of our room, holding each slip at arm's length in the gray light, his expression unchanging as his eyes moved across the abbreviated language of the telegraph. Those clipped, punctuationless phrases that strip communication to its skeleton and leave the reader to supply the flesh. He read the first. He set it on the windowsill. He read the second. He placed it beside the first. He read the third. He held it for a long moment, then turned to me with the particular stillness that preceded, in Holmes, not revelation but confirmation, the expression of a man who has built a bridge across a chasm in his mind and has just placed the final stone. The Peninsula and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, he said, confirms that no passenger named Leonard Vane has departed from or arrived at any major English port, Southampton, Liverpool, Plymouth, Tilbury, within the past 24 months. Furthermore, no passage has been booked under that name in any class for any destination during the same period. He picked up the second telegram. The Colonial Office has no record of a Leonard Vane registered as a resident British subject in the Cape Colony. No tax record, no electoral enrollment, no entry in the Cape Town directory for the current year or the 3 preceding years. He picked up the third, and Langdale Pike, whose knowledge of London's transient population is, as you know, encyclopedic in its breadth if not always admirable in its sources, reports that a man matching the physical description supplied by Fentham's records has been lodging in Camberwell, in South London, under the name Lawrence Verney, for approximately 14 months. He occupies a single room in a lodging house on Cold Harbor Lane. He pays his rent in advance, in cash. He receives no regular visitors. He departs every Tuesday morning carrying a leather document case and returns in the late afternoon. Pike's source, a charwoman who works the neighboring house, describes him as quiet, polite, and careful in the particular way that men are careful when they do not wish to be remembered. Holmes set the third telegram beside the others and looked at me. The 3 slips of paper lay in a row on the windowsill, and together they told a story so clear and so damning that I felt it settle over the case like a net. Leonard Vane is not in South Africa, I said. Leonard Vane has not been in South Africa for at least 2 years, possibly longer. He has been in London, 14 months confirmed, likely more, living under an assumed name constructed from the same initials as his own, L.V. Lawrence Verney. The vanity of the criminal mind, Watson, they cannot resist leaving a signature, even when concealment is the entire purpose of the exercise. And the letters from Cape Town, written in London, posted by an accomplice, or posted by Vane himself during an earlier trip to the Cape, predated and left with a forwarding agent. The stationery is the same. The hand would need to be compared, but I have little doubt it will match. He has been maintaining the fiction of his absence while positioning himself within a short railway journey of the estate he intends to claim. I stood at the window beside him and looked out at the village, the lane, the church tower, the fields beyond, all of it soaked in the gray, saturated light of an April afternoon that seemed unable to decide between rain and surrender. Somewhere out there, in a lodging house in Camberwell, carrying a leather document case, returning every Tuesday with the disciplined regularity of a man whose entire existence was organized around a single objective. Leonard Vane was waiting, not passively, not hopefully, but with the calculated, procedural patience of a man who had studied a dead man's will, identified its weakness, and built his life around the 11 days that separated a young woman from her inheritance. "The absent cousin is not absent," Holmes said. His voice was low, and it carried an edge I heard only when a case had crossed the boundary from intellectual exercise into something that engaged his sense of justice, that stern, unbending faculty that lived beneath the cold exterior like heat beneath ice. "He is merely patient, and patience, Watson, when it is applied to the dispossession of a young woman who has done nothing wrong, is not a virtue. It is a siege." He crossed to the bed, where his traveling bag lay open, and began repacking it with the decisive, economical movements of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to revisit it. "There are 2 seats on the evening train to Waterloo," he said. "From Waterloo, we can reach Camberwell within the hour. I wish to meet Mr. Lawrence Verney before he learns that anyone is looking for him." Chapter 5. The Man in Camberwell. Camberwell, in the spring of 1894, occupied that particular stratum of London geography that lies between respectability and decline, a neighborhood where the houses had been built for families of means and were now occupied by families of memory, where the stucco was beginning to crack, the railings to rust, and the curtains, once white, had settled into the indeterminate gray that comes not from dirt, but from years of washing in hard water and drying in London air. It was not squalid. Squalor has a certain honesty to it, a refusal to pretend. Camberwell's condition was something more melancholy, the careful, exhausting maintenance of appearances by people who could no longer quite afford the appearances they were maintaining. Cold Harbor Lane ran through the heart of this quiet decline. The lodging house, number 47, was a 3-story terrace with a bay window on the ground floor and a front door whose black paint had been touched up recently enough to suggest pride, and cracked deeply enough to suggest that pride was losing the battle with time. A brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head, polished but dented, stared out at the street with an expression of weary vigilance. Holmes knocked. The door was answered by a woman of approximately 60, stout, sharp-eyed, and dressed in the unassailable black bombazine of a landlady who considers her boarding house a sovereign territory subject to no authority but her own. Mrs. Carnforth. She gave the name with the clipped precision of someone who has introduced herself 10,000 times and expects the introduction to settle all questions of jurisdiction. Regarded Holmes's card with the particular suspicion that landladies reserve for any visitor who might disrupt the orderly management of her establishment. Then admitted us with the grudging efficiency of a woman who has decided that the disruption of refusal would be worse than the disruption of compliance. "Mr. Verney," she confirmed, leading us up a narrow staircase that smelled of boiled mutton and carbolic soap. "Second floor, the front room. A quiet gentleman. Pays his week in advance every Monday morning. No visitors. No noise. No complaints. If that man has done something irregular, Mr. Holmes, I shall be very much surprised, for he is the most regular lodger I have had in 14 years of keeping this house." Holmes asked his questions as we climbed. How long had Verney been in residence? 14 months come June. Did he receive post? Rarely. A letter every few weeks, never more than one at a time, always collected promptly. Did he keep regular hours? Very regular. Out every Tuesday with his leather case. Otherwise, in his room. Reading, she believed. She heard the pages turn through the floor. The room was at the front of the house, overlooking the lane. Mrs. Carnforth opened it with her master key and stood in the doorway as Holmes entered, her arms folded across her chest in the posture of a woman who is permitting an intrusion but wishes the record to show she does not approve. The room was small, sparsely furnished, and disciplined in a way that struck me immediately as significant. The bed was made with military precision, sheets tucked, blanket squared, pillow centered. A single chair stood at a writing table beneath the window. A washstand occupied the corner. There were no ornaments, no pictures, no personal effects visible anywhere in the room. Nothing that would tell a visitor who lived here what they cared about or where they had been. The room had been stripped of personality as deliberately as a stage set is stripped between acts. But two objects broke the anonymity. On the writing table, beside a pen and an inkwell, sat a leather writing box. Locked, Holmes noted, testing the clasp with one finger. And on the chair, as if it had been consulted recently and set down in haste, lay a Bradshaw's railway timetable, open to the southern section. Holmes picked up the Bradshaw's and turned it toward the light. A pencil mark, small, neat, nearly invisible, circled a single entry in the timetable's dense columns of type. Amurely, he replaced the timetable exactly as he had found it, positioned the chair at precisely the same angle, and turned to me with the economy of expression that characterized him when a case had moved beyond the stage of hypothesis and into the stage of pursuit. "We wait," he said. He selected a position in the corner of the room, where the angle of the door would conceal him from anyone entering, and stood there with the absolute, patient stillness of a cat watching a mouse hole. I took the chair by the window, where I could observe the lane below. Mrs. Carnforth withdrew to her kitchen, mollified by Holmes's assurance that her lodger was not in any trouble and that our business with him was a private matter of family concern. We waited. Holmes did not move. He did not speak. He did not read or pace or fidget. He simply stood in the corner and existed, with the terrifying economy of a man for whom stillness is not the absence of action, but its most concentrated form. I watched the lane. A costermonger passed with a barrow of watercress. A governess walked two children in matching sailor suits toward the park. A cat crossed the road with the unhurried sovereignty that cats bring to every landscape they inhabit. The afternoon wore on, and the gray light shifted by imperceptible degrees from the pallor of midday to the thicker, warmer gray that precedes an early dusk. I read nothing. I could not have concentrated. The room's bareness pressed upon me, the absence of any human mark, any trace of the man who had occupied this space for 14 months. It was not the emptiness of poverty. It was the emptiness of discipline, of a life pared down to a single purpose. Everything inessential removed, every comfort sacrificed to the machinery of an objective so consuming that the person pursuing it had ceased, in any meaningful sense, to live a life and had become, instead of function, a process aimed at an outcome, patient, relentless, and cold. He came at 4:30. I heard his step on the stairs before I saw him, a measured, unhurried tread, each footfall placed with the deliberate care of a man who has made a practice of not being heard and has refined the practice into something close to art. The door opened. A figure entered, and in the moment before he registered our presence, I was able to observe him with the advantage of surprise. He was not what I had expected. In truth, I am not certain what I had expected. The cases in which Holmes and I had been involved had taught me that villainy wears no consistent face, that malice has no particular build or bearing. But the image I had unconsciously constructed of a man who would orchestrate the disappearance of a young woman from her own wedding was larger, darker, more theatrical than the reality. Leonard Vane was slight, not frail. There was a wiriness to his frame that suggested endurance rather than weakness, but small, perhaps 5'7", with narrow shoulders and the particular stoop of a man who has spent too many years bent over books or documents. His face was angular, clean-shaven, with deep-set eyes of indeterminate color and a mouth set in a line so thin and level it might have been drawn with a ruler. His hair was dark, thinning at the temples, and combed back with a severity that seemed less vanity than discipline. He carried a leather document case under one arm. His clothes were good, but not new. A dark suit, well-brushed, carefully maintained. The uniform of a man who cannot afford to replace his wardrobe, but can afford to preserve it. He was perhaps 40. He looked older. He entered the room, closed the door behind him, set the document case on the writing table, and then, only then, saw me in the chair by the window. His body stiffened. His eyes moved from my face to the corner where Holmes stood. He took in the situation with a single, rapid evaluation, and what happened next was, I confess, not what I anticipated. He did not bolt. He did not shout. He did not reach for a weapon or fabricate an excuse or attempt the blustering indignation of an innocent man wrongly suspected. He looked at Holmes, and a faint expression crossed his face. Not fear, not anger, but something that resembled, of all things, recognition. Not recognition of Holmes's face. I do not believe he knew who we were, but recognition of the moment. The recognition of a man who has been expecting a particular event and has just watched it arrive. I wondered how long it would take, he said. His voice was quiet, cultured, and entirely steady. He spoke the way men speak who have rehearsed a confrontation in their minds so many times that the actual event, when it comes, feels like an echo rather than an original. Holmes stepped forward from the corner. Mr. Leonard Vane, formerly of Surrey, latterly of Cold Harbor Lane, Camberwell, under the name Lawrence Verney, cousin, by blood, to Miss Constance Radcliffe of Amnerley Grange. All correct, Vane said. He set his hat on the writing table beside the document case, removed his gloves, one finger at a time, with the meticulous care of a man who treats even small actions as opportunities for order, and sat on the edge of the bed. He did not look at me. His attention was entirely on Holmes, and it was the attention of a man who has been waiting for a worthy adversary and is assessing whether one has finally arrived. "You are Sherlock Holmes," he said. "I did not expect you specifically, but I expected someone. The wedding was 2 days ago. The girl has not been found. Sooner or later, someone competent would come. Where is Constance Radcliffe?" Holmes said. The question was delivered without preamble, without courtesy, without the diplomatic circuity that characterized his interviews with witnesses. This was not an interview. This was a confrontation, and Holmes's voice carried the cold, stripped-down precision he reserved for moments when time was a factor and patience was not. Vane did not flinch, but something moved behind his eyes, a flicker, brief and immediately controlled. That might have been fear or might have been something worse, uncertainty. "She is safe," he said. That was the arrangement. Describe the arrangement. Vane studied Holmes for a long moment. Then he began to speak, and his voice took on the measured, philosophical cadence of a man who has spent years constructing a justification and has arrived at a version he finds intellectually sound, morally defensible, and entirely self-serving. "My grandfather was Edward Vane Radcliffe, the elder brother. The estate was his by right, by primogeniture, by custom, by every principle of English inheritance that governs such matters. But his younger brother, Harold's father, contested the succession through a fraudulent codicil, a document I have spent my adult life proving was forged. The estate passed to the younger line. My grandfather died in poverty. My father died in reduced circumstances. I was raised on the knowledge that everything we had lost was stolen, not by force, not by war, but by a signature on a piece of paper." He paused. His hands rested on his knees, perfectly still. The reversion clause in Harold Radcliffe's will was, I believe, an act of conscience. He knew the inheritance was tainted. He built an escape, a condition that, if unmet, would return the estate to its rightful line. I did not create this clause. I did not influence it. I merely waited for it to take effect. "You did rather more than wait," Holmes said. "You moved to London under a false name. You corresponded with Miss Radcliffe. You arranged for her removal from the church at the precise moment the marriage would have been solemnized." Vane's composure held, but something tightened at its edges. The first visible sign that the narrative he had constructed was encountering a force it could not absorb. The removal was temporary. A delay. Nothing more. She was to be taken to a cottage, a place I had arranged, and held comfortably, safely, with every consideration, until the 11th of May had passed, after which the estate would revert to me by the terms of the will, and she would be released, unharmed, to live as she chose. And who was to execute this removal? A local man, a former sexton of St. Dunstan's. He knew the church, its history, its structure. He knew about the old passage beneath the vestry. I engaged him, through intermediaries, to assist Constance out of the church during the hymn and convey her to the cottage. His name, Hackett. I know him only as Hackett. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The question that followed was the one I had been waiting for, the question around which the entire case now turned, and which, I knew, would determine whether we were investigating a conspiracy or a catastrophe. When did you last hear from Hackett? The flicker returned, stronger this time, unmistakable. The morning of the wedding, Vane said. He sent word that everything was in place. Since then, nothing. I have heard nothing. You were to receive confirmation that she had reached the cottage. Yes, by that evening. It did not come. I assumed a delay, a complication. I waited. Another day. Nothing. The composure fractured. Not dramatically. Vane was too disciplined for that. But the crack was visible, running through the careful architecture of his self-justification like a fissure through stone. For the first time, he looked not like a man executing a plan, but like a man who had set something in motion and lost control of it. And the loss was only now, in this room, under Holmes's gaze, becoming real to him. Holmes turned to me, and what I saw in his face was something I had witnessed perhaps 3 times in all our years together. It was not the cold satisfaction of a deduction confirmed. It was not the intellectual pleasure of a pattern completed. It was fear, not for himself. Holmes was constitutionally incapable of fearing for himself, but for the woman whose fate had been entrusted to a man named Hackett, who had gone silent, who had not delivered her to the cottage, who had vanished into the same darkness that had swallowed the bride. The cottage, Holmes said, and his voice was flat in the way that metal is flat when it has been heated and beaten and cooled. Give me the address. Vane gave it. Holmes committed it to memory without writing it down. Then he crossed to the writing table, seized the Bradshaws, and began calculating connections with a speed that made the pages blur. Watson, he said, without looking up. The last train to Amerley departs Waterloo at 8:45. We have just under 4 hours. That is enough, provided we do not waste any of it on the comfortable illusion that this man's plan proceeded as he designed it. He turned back to Vane, and his final words to the man were delivered not with anger, but with something colder. The precise, surgical contempt Holmes reserved for those whose intelligence was sufficient to conceive a scheme, but insufficient to control its consequences. You believed you were orchestrating a delay, Mr. Vane. You were not. You were providing the mechanism by which someone else could commit a murder. And if Constance Radcliffe is dead, you will answer for it alongside whoever held the instrument, not because the law requires it, but because you built the machine and handed it to a stranger and called it justice. We left. Vane remained on the edge of the bed, his hands on his knees, his composure finally, completely, gone. The last thing I saw before I closed the door was his face, not the face of a villain, not the face of a mastermind, but the face of a man who had spent his life constructing an argument for his own righteousness and had just been shown, in a single sentence, that the argument was a coffin and he was standing inside it. We did not speak on the cab ride to Waterloo. The streets of South London passed in a procession of gas lamps and wet paving stones, the evening crowds thinning as we moved from the commercial thoroughfares into the quieter approach roads near the station. Holmes sat with his hands clasped between his knees and his gaze fixed on the middle distance, not seeing the city, not seeing the cab interior, seeing instead whatever architecture of inference was constructing itself behind his eyes. I sat beside him and felt, with an acuteness that surprised me, the weight of what we had learned. The plan, as Vane had described it, possessed a certain brutal logic. A hidden passage, known to a former sexton, a hymn, during which the congregation stood with their eyes on their hymnals or raised to heaven. A bride, guided through a concealed opening in the floor, conveyed through an underground passage, and delivered to a cottage where she would be held. Comfortably, Vane had insisted, as if comfort were a currency that could purchase the forgiveness of abduction, until a legal deadline had passed. It was not, in its conception, a violent plan. It was a lawyer's plan, a chess player's plan, a plan conceived by a man who believed that property law was a form of natural justice, and that the manipulation of persons was permissible so long as the manipulation served what he considered a rightful end. But the plan had broken. Hackett, the former sexton, the man who knew the passage, the instrument Vane had hired to execute the removal, had gone silent. No confirmation had reached Vane. No message. No word. 2 days had passed, and the woman who was supposed to be sitting in a country cottage, inconvenienced but unharmed, had instead vanished into a silence so complete that even the man who had arranged her disappearance did not know where she was. Holmes had asked Vane for Hackett's description. He was a man of middle age, 50 or thereabouts, heavy-set, with the coarsened hands and weathered face of someone who had spent decades in outdoor labor. He had served as sexton of St. Dunstan's for 15 years before being dismissed. Vane did not know the cause, and had since drifted between casual employment in the village and the surrounding farms. He drank, Vane admitted, not excessively, but steadily, in the manner of men who use drink as a medium for the dissolution of whatever pride their reduced circumstances have not already dissolved. Vane had engaged him through a chain of intermediaries, letters, passed through the boy at the railway inn, and had met him in person only once, in a field outside the village, at dusk, 6 weeks before the wedding. "And you trusted this man," Holmes had said, not as a question, but as a verdict. "I trusted the arrangement," Vane had replied. "The payment was substantial. The instructions were clear. You trusted money and clarity. You did not trouble yourself to assess the character of the man to whom you were entrusting a woman's liberty." Holmes's voice had held the particular flatness that, in him, served the function that shouting serves in other men. You treated Constance Radcliffe as a piece on a board, something to be moved, held, and released according to a timetable. It did not occur to you that the man you hired might have his own timetable, or that someone else might have hired him first. That last sentence had struck Vane with visible force. "Someone else," he had repeated, and for the first time his voice had lost its measured cadence, cracking on the second word like a beam under pressure. Holmes had not answered. He had taken the Bradshaws and begun calculating trains, and his refusal to elaborate was, I understood, not cruelty but necessity. The necessity of a man who could not afford to spend another minute in a Camberwell lodging house explaining consequences to a man who should have foreseen them. Now, in the cab, those consequences pressed upon me with a specificity I found difficult to bear. A woman in a wedding dress, guided through a dark passage beneath a church, delivered not to a cottage but to where? The crypt itself? A sealed chamber underground? Left there by a man who had been paid by Vane to delay her, but perhaps paid by someone else to do something worse? The veil at the weir, the clean cut, the planted evidence of suicide. I forced myself to articulate the thought, because the act of speaking it aloud was the only means I had of preventing it from becoming more terrible inside my own mind. Holmes, if Hackett did not take her to the cottage, if he was acting on someone else's instructions, then Constance Radcliffe is still beneath the church, Holmes said. He did not look at me. His voice was quiet, level, and stripped of every quality except the one that mattered, certainty. The passage leads downward. It connects to the old crypt, a space that has been sealed and forgotten for decades, known only to those who have served the church in capacities that require knowledge of its full structure. A sexton would know. A sexton dismissed from his post would retain the knowledge and bear the resentment. And a sexton offered sufficient payment by 2 different parties for 2 different purposes would accept both payments and serve the purpose of whoever offered the more permanent arrangement. "Mrs. Hartley," I said. The name tasted of bile. Holmes turned to me then, and what I saw in his face confirmed what I had feared. He was not deducing. He was racing. The machinery of his mind was operating at full capacity, But for once it was not running toward the satisfaction of an intellectual problem. It was running toward a woman who might, at this very moment, be alive in a darkness she could not escape, in a space no one knew existed, beneath a church that would resume its ordinary services on Sunday morning while she died of thirst beneath its floor. The orange blossom, he said. That was the one detail that troubled me from the beginning. Not the passage is mechanical. Not the timing is logical. But the scent, orange blossom in a church where no orange blossom was present. Watson, orange blossom oil is used in perfumery, but it is also used, in concentrated form, as a masking agent. Its sweetness is overpowering. It clings to fabric, to stone, to skin. If someone wished to ensure that no one could detect the smell of disturbed earth, of open stone, of a passage freshly unsealed, a few drops of concentrated oil, applied to the flagstone and the surrounding area, would accomplish precisely that. Mrs. Hartley's perfume, I said, remembering. Mrs. Hartley attended the ceremony. Mrs. Hartley had access to the church before the service. Mrs. Hartley knew, from Vane's letters, exactly when and how the passage would be used. And Mrs. Hartley, Watson, whose gloves were spotless after 2 hours of crisis, whose composure never faltered, whose grief was performed rather than felt, had every reason to ensure that Constance Radcliffe did not merely disappear from the ceremony, but disappeared from the world. He leaned forward and struck the roof of the cab with his fist. "Driver, Waterloo, and be quick about it. We have a train to catch and very little margin for error." The cab lurched forward. The streets blurred, and I sat beside Sherlock Holmes in the gathering darkness of a London evening and felt, for the first time in this case, the thing I had been resisting since the curate's breathless account on the railway platform. Not curiosity, not intellectual engagement, not the familiar thrill of the chase, but fear. Simple, human, ungovernable fear for a woman I had never met, who was perhaps alive in the dark beneath a country church, waiting for a rescue that she could not know was coming. Chapter 6. The Crypt Beneath St. Dunstan's. The church was locked when we arrived. The village was asleep, or if not asleep, then quiet in the particular way that English villages are quiet after 10 o'clock, when the inn has closed its doors and the last dog has been called in and the darkness settles over the rooftops like a hand laid gently but firmly over the mouth of the world. No light showed in any window. The church tower was a black absence against the marginally less black sky, and the churchyard you stood motionless in air that was cold, still, and heavy with the smell of wet earth and stone. Holmes moved to the north side of the church without hesitation, to the vestry extension, where a door of heavy oak, banded with iron, provided the clergy's private entrance. He knelt before the lock. From his coat, he produced the slim leather case I had seen perhaps a dozen times in our association and which he carried, I believe, more consistently than any other tool in his possession, more consistently than his lens, his measuring tape, or even his revolver. The picks were inside. He worked in silence, his fingers moving with the precise, unhurried deftness of a man for whom locks are not obstacles, but conversations conducted in a language he happens to speak fluently. 8 seconds. Perhaps 10. The mechanism turned. The door opened inward on hinges that groaned once and then submitted. Inside, the vestry was small, cold, and absolutely dark. I lit the candle I had purchased at the inn, a thick tallow stub that smelled of rendered fat and produced a flame of surprising steadiness, and the room assembled itself around us in the warm, unsteady light. A vestment press against one wall, a shelf of prayer books, a table bearing the parish register, and the floor, flagstone, uneven, matching the chancel beyond the connecting door. Holmes crossed directly to the stone he had identified that morning. In the candlelight, the difference in mortar was more visible than it had been in daylight. The Portland cement appeared lighter, smoother, almost clinical against the ancient lime pointing that surrounded it. He knelt and ran his fingers along the join. Then he produced a short iron lever, also from his coat, that inexhaustible garment, and worked the blade into the seam between the target stone and its neighbor. The stone resisted. Then it did not. It lifted with a grinding, mineral protest, releasing a breath of air from the darkness below that struck my face like the exhalation of something buried and still breathing. The air was cold, colder than the vestry, colder than the night outside, and it carried a smell I knew. Not the clean, dry cold of a cellar or a wine vault, but the thick, saturated cold of underground water and ancient stone and earth that has not seen light in decades. It was the smell of forgetting, the smell of a space that had been sealed and abandoned and was now, suddenly, forcibly, remembered. Below the stone, steps descended, narrow, steep, carved from the same sandstone as the church walls, worn smooth at their centers by feet that had last used them. When? A century ago? 2. The candle flame bent toward the opening, drawn by the draft, confirming what Holmes had detected that morning. Air was moving below. The passage was not sealed at both ends. Somewhere it opened. Holmes descended first. I followed, holding the candle high, and the vestry closed above us as we dropped below the level of the church floor. The steps curved, 7, 8, 9, and the walls pressed closer with each step, narrowing from the width of a doorway to something barely wider than a man's shoulders. The stone was wet, not dripping, but coated with a sheen of moisture that gleamed in the candlelight and made each handhold treacherous. I felt the walls scrape against my coat as we descended, and the sound, fabric against ancient stone, a dry, whispering rasp, seemed disproportionately loud in the confined space, as if the passage itself were listening and did not approve of what it heard. At the base of the steps, the passage leveled and turned. Holmes paused. I held the candle forward, and the light reached perhaps 10 feet before the darkness absorbed it entirely, and what those 10 feet revealed was a low, arched corridor of Norman construction, rough stone, a vaulted ceiling no more than 5 feet high, and a floor of packed earth that showed, with unmistakable clarity, the recent prints of boots. 2 sets, one heavy, broad-soled, a working man's boot, one lighter, narrower, with the pointed toe and low heel of a woman's wedding shoe. Holmes pointed to the prints. He said nothing. The prints said everything. We followed them into the dark. The passage ran for perhaps 40 yards. I could not be certain, for distance underground is a treacherous measure, distorted by darkness and the compression of senses deprived of their usual reference points. The ceiling pressed low enough that Holmes, who was taller than I, was forced to stoop, and the sound of our breathing filled the corridor with a rhythm that seemed too large for the space, as if the passage were amplifying our presence and broadcasting it ahead of us into the dark. The walls wept moisture. The floor was soft with accumulated damp, and our boots left deep impressions in the earth beside the prints we were following. 2 tracks, running parallel, the heavy boots and the wedding shoes, pressed into the ground with the uneven depth that suggested urgency on one side and resistance on the other. The passage widened, the ceiling rose, and the candle flame, which had been steady in the narrow corridor, suddenly fluttered and guttered in a space that opened around us like the interior of a held breath. We had emerged into a chamber. The candlelight was insufficient to illuminate its full extent, but I could perceive its dimensions through the quality of the echo. Our footsteps returned to us with the slight delay and softened edges that indicated a room perhaps 15 feet square and 8 or 9 feet high. The walls were stone, rough-hewn, and the ceiling was vaulted in the Norman manner, a series of low, heavy arches that converged on a central point and gave the space the appearance of a chapel stripped of every furnishing except its bones. This had been, I understood, a charnel chamber, a repository for the overflow of the churchyard, common in medieval churches, where bones were stored when grave space was exhausted. The bones were long gone. What remained was the architecture of their keeping, cold, hollow, and profoundly silent. But the chamber was not empty. In the far corner, barely within the reach of the candlelight, I saw a pallet bed. A rough thing, a straw mattress laid on the stone floor, covered with a single blanket. Beside it, a clay jug. Beside the jug, a stub of candle, burned to a flat disk of wax no thicker than a penny, the wick consumed entirely. Whoever had been given that candle had burned it to nothing, had held on to its light until the last possible moment, and had then been left in a darkness so absolute that even the memory of light must have felt like a cruelty. And on the pallet, pressed into the corner where 2 walls met, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around them, her face turned away from us, a woman in a white dress. "Constance," Holmes said. His voice was steady, but I caught. I who had listened to that voice in 100 investigations, in moments of triumph and danger and cold analytical certainty, a note I had never heard before. Relief. Raw, undisguised, uncontrolled. The detective had been afraid, and the fear had just broken. She did not move at first. She did not respond to the name or to the light or to the sound of our approach. I set the candle on the floor and knelt beside her, and what I found, as a physician, drove a blade of fury through my professional composure that I had to grip with both hands to keep from showing. She was alive. That was the first and most important thing, and I stated it plainly because for several terrible seconds, as I reached for her wrist and felt for the pulse, I was not certain it would be true. But the pulse was there, rapid, thin, thready, the heartbeat of a body operating at the margins of its reserves. Her skin was cold, not the chill of a room without a fire, but the deep, penetrating cold of prolonged exposure to underground temperatures, a cold that had seeped through the wedding dress, through the petticoats, through the skin, and settled in the tissues beneath. Her lips were cracked and dry. Her eyes, when she finally turned toward the candlelight, were unfocused, dilated, struggling to accommodate illumination after what I estimated had been nearly 48 hours of total darkness. Her wrists bore rope marks, red, raw, blistered in places, the marks of cord tied tightly and worked against over many hours. But the ropes were gone. She had freed herself. I could see the fibers caught beneath her fingernails, the torn skin on her thumbs where she had pulled and twisted against the bindings until the flesh gave way before the cord did. "Dr. Watson," Holmes said, and his voice had recovered its control, though something beneath the control, something human, something that the cold exterior was designed to contain, remained audible to anyone who knew how to listen. "How is she?" "Dehydrated, hypothermic, exhausted, but alive, Holmes. She is alive." I gave her water from my own flask, small sips, carefully measured, the instinct of a physician overriding the instinct of a man who wanted to pour the entire contents down her throat. She drank. She coughed. She drank again. And then, with a voice that was barely a voice, a whisper scraped raw by thirst and darkness and the particular hoarseness that comes from calling out for help until the throat can produce nothing further, she spoke. "He brought me here." "Hackett," Holmes said. She nodded. The movement was small, effortful, and infinitely weary. "He told me. He said it was Mr. Vane's arrangement, that I would be taken to a cottage, that it was only for a few days. He guided me through the passage during the hymn. I did not resist because I believed it was what Vane had written in his letters. A delay. He said I would not be harmed. But he did not take you to a cottage." "No," the word was flat, emptied of everything except fact. "He brought me here. He tied my hands. He left the candle and the jug. He said, before he left, he said," she stopped. Her eyes closed. When they opened again, they held something I recognized from my years of medical practice. The particular, terrible clarity of a person who has passed through extremity and emerged with an understanding they would rather not possess. He said, "Mrs. Hartley sends her regards." The words fell into the silence of the charnel chamber and lay there, heavy and final, like stones dropped into still water. Holmes did not speak. I did not speak. The candle flame trembled in a draft neither of us could feel, and the shadows on the walls shifted and resettled, and the name, Hartley, hung in the cold air with the permanence of an epitaph. Her own aunt, her guardian, the woman who had raised her since her mother's death, the woman who had braided her hair and buttoned her dresses and sat beside her bed when she was ill, the woman who had, according to Molly Tanner, struck her across the face 3 weeks before the wedding, the woman whose gloves were spotless, the woman who had been waiting. Holmes lifted Constance from the pallet. She weighed, I thought, almost nothing, the dress adding bulk that her body no longer possessed. I took the candle. We turned toward the passage, toward the steps, toward the church above, toward air and light and the world of living things, and we left the charnel chamber behind, that cold, dark room where a woman had been placed like an offering in a tomb, left to die in silence beneath the church where she was to have been married, and where no one in the village above, no one in the congregation that had witnessed her vanishing, no one in the comfortable narrative of bridal nerves or ghostly curses or suicide at the weir would ever have thought to look. We carried her through the passage in silence, Holmes bearing her weight, I holding the candle ahead of us and clearing the way through the low sections where the ceiling pressed down and the stone wept its slow, mineral tears. Constance did not speak. She had closed her eyes and turned her face into Holmes's shoulder with the unself-conscious trust of someone for whom consciousness itself had become an act of will maintained past the point of endurance, and who had finally, in the presence of rescue, permitted the will to falter. Her breathing was shallow but steady. The wedding dress, once white, was filthy, smeared with the dark earth of the passage floor, the hem torn where it had caught on rough stone, the bodice stained with the damp that had seeped through from the charnel chamber's walls. She looked, in the guttering candlelight, like a figure from a painting of Ophelia. Not the serene, floating Ophelia of the pre-Raphaelites, but something more honest and more terrible. A woman pulled from the water before the drowning was complete, alive but bearing the marks of an immersion that should have killed her. The passage seemed longer on the return. Perhaps it was the added weight. Perhaps it was the compression of my attention into the narrow corridor of candlelight and the uneven floor, and the necessity of ensuring that Holmes, who could not see his own feet while carrying Constance, did not stumble on the worn stone steps. Perhaps it was simply the distortion that urgency imposes on distance. The sensation that the space itself was resisting our departure, reluctant to release what it had been given. We reached the steps. We climbed. The vestry flagstone stood open above us, a rectangle of marginally lighter darkness that represented, in that moment, the border between the world beneath and the world above, between burial and breathing, between the intention of murder and its failure. Holmes passed Constance up to me. I had climbed first, setting the candle on the vestry floor, and I received her with arms that shook, not from the weight, but from the accumulated fury that I had suppressed throughout the descent, and that now, with the stone floor of the vestry beneath my boots and the cold night air reaching us through the open door, demanded release. Holmes climbed out after her. He was breathing hard. The passage had been low enough to force him into a crouch for much of the distance, and the strain of carrying another person through such a space was not trivial even for a man of his physical resilience. He stood in the vestry and looked down at the open flagstone, at the steps descending into darkness, at the passage that led to the chamber where a woman had been left to die, and his face, in the candlelight, was a landscape I did not recognize. Not the analytical mask, not the cold precision, not even the rare warmth that occasionally surfaced in moments of private humanity, but something rawer and more fundamental. Anger. Not the sharp, surgical anger he deployed as a tool in interrogations. A deeper anger. The kind that lives in the marrow and does not dissipate when the intellect resumes control. He spoke as we carried Constance through the vestry and out into the churchyard. He spoke with the rapid, compressed fluency of a man who has assembled a complete narrative and is delivering it not for the listener's benefit, but for his own. To hear the thing aloud, to test its coherence against the medium of language, to confirm that the structure he has built in his mind bears its own weight. Two conspiracies, Watson. Not one. Two, running in parallel, intersecting at a single point, Hackett, and diverging at their objectives. The night air struck us as we emerged. I had never been so grateful for wind. It was cold, carrying the damp of the Surrey hills and the distant smell of the river, and it moved across my face and through my hair and into my lungs with a cleansing force that felt, after the sealed atmosphere of the passage, like the first breath of a life I had not been certain I would continue. The first conspiracy was Vane's. Conceived in grievance, executed through intermediaries, designed to delay Constance's marriage past her 25th birthday so that the estate would revert to him under the terms of the will. Vane's plan was bloodless, at least in intention. Constance was to be removed from the ceremony, taken to a cottage, held for 11 days, and released. The crime was abduction. The motive was inheritance. The method was the passage beneath the vestry, known to Hackett, Time to coincide with the hymn. We laid Constance on a pew inside the nave. The church was warmer than the churchyard, sheltered from the wind, and I needed light to examine her properly. Holmes lit the chancel candles one by one methodically, and the church filled with a wavering golden light that transformed the cold gray space I had first entered the previous afternoon into something almost warm. The second conspiracy was Mrs. Hartley's. Older, I suspect, conceived not in weeks but in months, perhaps years. Hartley had been in correspondence with Vane. She knew about the reversion clause. She knew about Vane's claim to the estate, and she recognized, long before Vane arrived at his plan, that his grievance could be made to serve her own. I checked Constance's pulse again, stronger now, steadied by the water and the warmth. I wrapped her in my coat and placed a cushion beneath her head. She was drifting in and out of consciousness, her lips moving occasionally without sound, her fingers gripping the edge of the coat with the reflexive tenacity of someone who has learned, in the darkness, that letting go of anything is a luxury she cannot afford. Hartley's position was precarious. She was dependent on the estate, on her niece's goodwill, on the house, on the income that came from her role as guardian. When Constance married, that role would end. The new husband would assume authority. Hartley would be, at best, a guest in a house she had managed for 9 years. At worst, she would be displaced entirely, reduced to a cottage, a pension, the charity of a niece she had come to resent. Holmes paced the aisle as he spoke, his long shadow moving across the walls like a second figure, darker and less restrained. She fed Vane information. She encouraged his plan. She may even have suggested the mechanism, the passage, the timing, the hymn. But she added a refinement Vane did not know about. She went to Hackett separately. She offered him a second payment, larger, I suspect, than Vane's, and a different set of instructions. Not the cottage, the crypt, not 11 days, permanently. He stopped pacing. He stood at the chancel rail, the exact spot where Constance had said, "I will," and then ceased to exist, and looked down at the flagstones as if he could see through them to the passage below. Constance was to die in the charnel chamber, slowly, of thirst, in darkness, and no one would know where to look because the evidence would point elsewhere, to the weir, to the veil, to the convenient fiction of a despondent bride who walked into the water. The estate would revert to Vane. Hartley had negotiated a private settlement. I am certain of it, though the proof will require Vane's correspondence and Hackett's testimony to confirm. She would retain the house, a pension for life, the security she had spent 9 years fearing she would lose. He turned to me. The anger was still there, but it had been joined by something else. A weariness that I had rarely seen in Holmes, the exhaustion not of the body but of the spirit, the particular fatigue that comes from understanding, fully and precisely, the mechanics of a cruelty that was designed to be invisible. The orange blossom, Watson. That was Hartley's touch. She applied concentrated oil of neroli to the flagstone and the surrounding area before the ceremony, ostensibly part of the wedding preparations, the decoration of the church, the scattering of fragrance for the bride. In reality, it was a masking agent. It concealed the smell of disturbed earth, of fresh mortar, of a passage recently opened, and it left behind the only trace of Constance that anyone would find, a scent with no source, lingering at the spot where the bride had vanished, feeding the superstition, the whispers about the mother's curse, the comfortable narrative that what had happened in St. Dunstan's was beyond human explanation and therefore beyond human investigation. The candles flickered. Constance stirred on the pew, murmured something I could not catch, and was still again. The church settled around us, ancient stone, ancient timber, ancient silence, and I stood in the nave and looked at the woman on the pew and felt, beneath the fury and the relief and the professional assessment of her condition, something I could not easily name. Not pity. Pity is what we feel for strangers. This was closer to grief, Grief for the particular cruelty of an intimacy turned to murder. An aunt, a guardian. A woman who had braided the girl's hair, who had sat at the breakfast table with her, who had approved her wedding dress and pinned her veil, and walked beside her to the church. A woman who had, while performing these rituals of affection, arranged for her niece to die alone in the dark beneath the floor on which she stood. I have written elsewhere of the horrors that men commit from greed, from rage, from the desperate arithmetic of self-preservation. But the horror of this was different. It was domestic. It was quiet. It operated within the architecture of love, the same house, the same meals, the same daily courtesies, and the distance between the affection on the surface and the calculation beneath was so small, so invisible, so perfectly maintained, that Constance herself had not seen it until a man named Hackett closed a stone above her head and delivered her aunt's compliments. The night air moved through the open vestry door, stirring the candle flames, carrying the smell of wet earth and churchyard yew. Holmes closed the flagstone. He replaced it with the same care with which it had been lifted, pressing the edges back into their mortar bed, and the stone settled with a low, final sound that echoed briefly in the empty church, and then was gone. "We will need Briggs," Holmes said, "and the county inspector, and a physician more rested than you, Watson, though I suspect you will not relinquish the patient until one arrives." He was correct. I did not. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The morning that followed was bright in the way that April mornings sometimes are after a night of heavy cloud. The sky washed to a pale, almost colorless blue, the sunlight thin but persistent, falling across the village with the impersonal clarity of a lamp lit in a room where something has been hidden and suddenly, mercilessly, is not. It was the kind of light that does not flatter. It exposes. The puddles in the lane reflected it like fragments of broken mirror. The thatch on the cottages, which had seemed merely weathered in the gray of previous days, showed its age and its moss and its slow disintegration with unforgiving precision. And Amnerley Grange, as we approached it for the second time, stood on its hill with every crack in its stucco, every stain on its stone, every sag in its Georgian additions visible and unadorned, a house that looked, in the morning light, as if it had been holding its breath for a very long time and had finally, exhaustedly exhaled. We were four: Holmes, myself, Sergeant Briggs, who had been roused before dawn and who wore the expression of a man whose professional assumptions had been not merely corrected but demolished, and Inspector Caldwell of the County Constabulary, a lean, quiet man of middle years, who had arrived on the first train from Guildford, and who listened to Holmes's account with the focused stillness of a predator assessing the distance to its quarry. Caldwell asked few questions. The questions he asked were precise. He was, I judged, the kind of policeman Holmes respected, competent, unpretentious, and entirely uninterested in credit. The housekeeper admitted us. She did not ask why we had come. She looked at the four of us, at the inspector's badge, at Briggs's uniform, at Holmes's face, and stepped aside with an expression that suggested she had been expecting this visit, or something like it, for longer than she would have been willing to admit. Mrs. Hartley was in the drawing room. She was dressed for church, a dark blue dress with a high collar, a hat with a small veil, gloves buttoned to the wrist. Fresh gloves, immaculate. She sat in a straight-backed chair near the window, her hands folded in her lap, and the sunlight fell across her with the same unsparing clarity it had laid upon the house. She looked composed. She looked ready. She looked, I thought, like a woman who had dressed for her own arrest with the same care she would have brought to dressing for a funeral. The same recognition that the occasion required formality and that formality, however empty, was the last defense available. Holmes did not sit. He stood before her and laid out the chain of evidence with the precision of a man placing cards on a table, one by one, face up. The correspondence with Vane, months of letters exchanged through intermediaries, in which Hartley had fed him information about the estate, about Constance's plans, about the wedding date. The engagement of Hackett, Vane's instrument, yes, but also Hartley's, paid twice for two different purposes. The crypt passage, reopened under Hartley's direction, sealed with new mortar to ensure it would hold. The concentrated oil of neroli, applied to the flagstone to mask the smell of disturbed earth. The veil, cut with shears and placed at the weir to construct the fiction of suicide. And the instructions to Hackett, not the cottage, not the delay, not the temporary inconvenience Vane believed he had arranged, but the charnel chamber, the darkness. The jug of water that would sustain life just long enough for the investigation to conclude and the attention of the village to move elsewhere, and then would not sustain it any longer. Holmes spoke for perhaps 5 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not editorialize. He presented facts in sequence, connected by logic, supported by physical evidence, and the effect was not dramatic but surgical. The clean, methodical opening of a wound that had been hidden beneath layers of social respectability and familial duty, and the particular English conviction that certain things do not happen in certain kinds of families. Mrs. Hartley listened. She did not interrupt. She did not deny. She sat in her chair with her hands folded and her face arranged in the expression of dignified endurance she had worn since the wedding. That careful, calibrated mask of suffering that I had distrusted from the first moment I saw it, and now understood completely. It was not grief. It had never been grief. It was preparation. She had been wearing the face of a mourning woman because she had intended, from the beginning, that there would be something to mourn. When Holmes finished, the room was quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked. A bird sang outside the window, a blackbird, absurdly cheerful, filling the silence with a music that seemed to belong to a different morning in a different world. Mrs. Hartley spoke. Her voice was level, controlled, and empty of everything except the truth she had apparently decided, in the silence, to offer. The estate was all I had. She looked not at Holmes, but at the window, at the gardens, the hill, the fields beyond, the landscape she had managed and maintained and depended upon for 9 years. Constance would have married and forgotten me. She would have had her husband and her house and her children, and I would have been, what? A spinster aunt in a back bedroom. A woman tolerated at the dinner table out of obligation. I gave 9 years of my life to that girl and to this house, and in return I was to receive the privilege of being gradually, politely made invisible. She paused. Something moved in her face, not remorse, not precisely, but a shadow of the thing that might have been remorse in a woman whose emotional architecture had not been so thoroughly colonized by resentment that no other structure could be built upon it. She had her mother's cruelty, that same cold clarity, that same ability to look at a person and see through them to the inconvenience they represented. Her mother looked at me that way for 20 years, and when Constance began to look at me the same way, I knew it would happen again. I would be put aside, gently, politely, with every appearance of kindness, and the kindness would be worse than cruelty, because it would require me to be grateful for my own diminishment. Inspector Caldwell stepped forward. He spoke the words of arrest with the practiced, neutral formality of a man who has spoken them many times and understands that the words themselves are not punishment but procedure. The mechanism by which the law claims jurisdiction over actions that have exceeded the boundaries of what a society can tolerate. Mrs. Hartley stood. She straightened her gloves. She adjusted her hat. She walked to the door with the same measured tread with which she had entered the parlor at the Lamb and Anchor, and I watched her go, and saw in her bearing not villainy but the terrible logic of a woman who had convinced herself, over years and through the slow accumulation of grievance, that survival and justice were the same thing, and that the elimination of the person who threatened her survival was therefore not murder but self-defense. Briggs accompanied Caldwell and Mrs. Hartley to the waiting carriage. Holmes and I remained in the drawing room. The bird was still singing. The sunlight still fell. The house was, for the first time since we had entered it, completely quiet, the silence not of occupation, but of evacuation, the particular stillness that descends upon a house when the organizing intelligence that maintained its order has been removed, and the house itself does not yet know what it is without her. "Hackett," Holmes said. "He will be found. A man who drinks, who has been paid handsomely for a crime he did not fully understand, and who has watched that crime fail. Such a man does not flee. He hides. And a man who hides in a village where he has lived his entire life hides badly." He was correct. Hackett was found that afternoon in a barn on the Ashford farm, 3/4 drunk on gin he had purchased with Hartley's money, shaking with a terror that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the dawning comprehension that the woman who had paid him had intended a death, and that his hands, his thick, weathered sexton's hands, had been the instruments. I attended to Constance at the inn for the remainder of that day and into the evening. A local physician, Dr. Moorcroft, a sensible, unflappable man with 30 years of country practice behind him, arrived by noon and confirmed my assessment. Severe dehydration, mild hypothermia now resolving, contusions and lacerations to the wrists consistent with prolonged struggle against rope bindings, and the general exhaustion of a body that had been denied food, adequate water, warmth, and light for approximately 48 hours. There was no evidence of graver physical harm. She had been left to die, but she had not been touched. Hackett, for all his failings, had apparently drawn a line at direct violence, the cowardice of a man who could seal a woman in a tomb but could not bring himself to lay a hand upon her. Whether this constituted mercy or merely a different species of cruelty was a question I did not care to answer. Constance slept for most of the afternoon. When she woke, in the early evening, she was clearer, her eyes focused, her voice stronger, her hands steady enough to hold the cup of broth the innkeeper's wife had prepared. She sat up in the bed in the inn's best room, wrapped in borrowed shawls, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked, in the lamplight, both older and younger than the woman I had been imagining for the past 2 days, older in her eyes, which held the particular flat knowledge of someone who has seen the interior of a malice they had not believed possible, and younger in her face, which was unmarked, open, and possessed of a beauty that was less conventional than structural. The beauty of strong bones and direct gaze and an absolute refusal to look away from what was in front of her. She did not cry. I had expected tears, the release of tension, the flooding of emotion that follows survival. But Constance Radcliffe did not cry. She sat in silence for a long time, looking at the wall above the fireplace, as if reading something written there that only she could see, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, and her words were not what I anticipated. "Is my aunt well?" The question struck me with a force I was not prepared for. Not its content. That was perhaps predictable. The reflexive concern of a woman who had spent her life in the orbit of another, and could not even now entirely escape that gravitational pull. It was the tone. There was no anger in it, no bitterness, no satisfaction. There was grief, the particular grief of someone who has lost not a person, but an understanding, who has been forced to revise the foundational narrative of their own life and has not yet found a replacement. "She has been arrested," I said. "She is in the custody of the county constabulary." Constance nodded. The nod was small, contained, and final. The acknowledgement of a fact she had already known, or had known would come, and which she had been carrying in the same part of herself that had carried the weight of the darkness and the cold and the slow, terrible passage of hours without light. She was not always what she became, Constance said. When I was young, after my mother died, she was kind, genuinely kind. She held me when I cried. She read to me. She sat with me through the fevers. I do not say this to excuse her. I say it because it is true, and because the truth of it is worse than if she had always been what she was at the end. She looked at me then, and the question she asked was not a question a patient asks a physician, nor a victim asks a rescuer. It was a question one human being asks another when the architecture of their understanding has collapsed and they are standing in the rubble, searching for a single beam that will bear weight. Dr. Watson, can a person love someone and still destroy them? I sat in the chair beside her bed and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I thought of the cases Holmes and I had investigated, the husbands who killed from jealousy, the mothers who poisoned from despair, the brothers who betrayed from greed, so intertwined with affection that the two could not be separated even by the men who felt them. I thought of my own experience, of the patients I had lost not to disease, but to the complicated, contradictory, impossible tangles of human attachment, where love and harm occupied the same hand and could not be distinguished by the person wielding them. I believe they can, I said. I believe it is one of the most terrible things about the human heart, that it is capable of holding both at once, and that neither cancels the other. She was quiet for a long time after that. The fire crackled. The inn settled around us with the creaks and sighs of an old building adjusting to the temperature of evening. And Constance Radcliffe, who had been left to die in the dark by the woman who raised her, closed her eyes and breathed, and the breath was steady, and the steadiness was not peace, but the decision to continue in its absence. 3 days passed. Constance recovered. The color returned to her face. The marks on her wrists began to scab and heal. She ate. She walked in the garden behind the inn, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, and the April sun, warmer now, more committed to the season, fell on her shoulders and her loose dark hair and the borrowed dress she wore in place of the wedding gown she would never wear again. They married on the 4th day. It was nothing like the first ceremony. There were no flowers, no garlands on the lich gate, no congregation in the pews, no cold meats laid out at the Lamb and Anchor, no 3-tiered cake presiding over a horseshoe of white linen. The village did not attend. The village was not invited. What happened in St. Dunstan's that Thursday morning was not a celebration, but a completion. The quiet, deliberate finishing of something that had been violently interrupted, conducted not with joy, but with the particular, clear-eyed resolve of two people who have decided that the thing they set out to do is worth doing and will not be prevented from doing it a second time. Constance wore a plain gray dress, borrowed, I believe, from Miss Driscoll, with no veil, no train, no orange blossom. Her mother's cameo brooch was pinned at her throat, its clasp fastened firmly, its small carved Ariadne facing outward as if to say, "I have been through the labyrinth, and I have returned, and I will not be taken again." Edwin Ashford stood beside her in a dark suit, clean-shaven for the first time since the first wedding, his face drawn but steady, and he held her hand throughout the service with a grip that I suspected he would not willingly loosen for some time to come. The Reverend Mr. Tidwell performed the ceremony. The vicar, Mr. Pennick, shaken by the events and by the discovery that his church concealed a passage he had never known about, had requested a brief leave of absence, and Tidwell, the young curate who had found us on the railway platform, had stepped forward with a willingness that I found both admirable and moving. His voice, which had been fragmented and stammering 4 days earlier, was calm now, clear and firm, carrying the ancient words of the Book of Common Prayer with a reverence that seemed renewed rather than routine, as if the events of the week had stripped the liturgy of its familiarity and returned it to something vital and meant. Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Holmes and I stood as witnesses, Holmes in the pew to the right, I to the left. There was no hymn this time, no congregation to stand, no moment of collective distraction during which a woman could be made to vanish. The church was empty and silent, and the silence itself felt like a form of protection, as if the building, having failed once to keep safe what had been entrusted to it, was now holding its breath, watching, determined not to fail again. The vows were exchanged. Constance spoke them without hesitation. I take thee, Edwin, to my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish, and to obey, till death us do part. And her voice did not waver, and her hand did not tremble. And the words, which are spoken 10,000 times a year in 10,000 churches across England, and which have become, through repetition, almost invisible in their meaning, were audible in that empty church with a clarity that made them new. Not ceremonial, not decorative, structural, load-bearing. The words of a woman who had been in the dark and had returned to the light and was building, with language and intent, a structure that the darkness could not take from her. Tidwell joined their hands. Those whom God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. Holmes, I noticed, looked toward the vestry flagstone. His gaze rested there for a moment, just a moment, and then returned to the couple at the chancel rail. His expression was unreadable, but his hand, resting on the back of the pew, was still, and the stillness was not the analytical stillness I knew so well, but something quieter, something that might, in another man, have been called peace. The register was opened, the pen was dipped. Constance signed, her new name, her married name, the name of the life she was choosing, and the sound of the nib on paper was the loudest thing in the church. Louder than the vows, louder than the silence. The scratch of ink on a page, making permanent what had been spoken, making legal what had been intended, making real what someone had tried to erase. It was done. We stepped outside. The April light was thin but present, not warm, not generous, but there, falling on the churchyard and the lych gate and the bare oak crossbeam, with the quiet persistence of a season that intends to continue regardless of what has happened beneath its sky. We took the afternoon train. The branch line carried us from Amnerley Halt, through the same corridor of budding hawthorn we had traversed 4 days earlier, and at Farncombe Junction we changed for the London Express. The same platform, the same bench, the same view of the Surrey hills rolling south toward a horizon that looked, in the late afternoon light, as if it had been painted in watercolors and left out in the rain. Everything was the same. Nothing was the same. The landscape had not changed. We had passed through it and returned, and the passage had altered us in ways that the landscape itself could not perceive and would not record. Holmes sat in the window seat of our compartment and watched the fields pass. He had been quiet since the ceremony, not the analytical silence of an active mind, nor the compressed silence that preceded a deduction, but a different quiet, deeper and less familiar, the silence of a man who has completed a task and is assessing not its mechanics, but its meaning. The afternoon sun fell across his profile and illuminated features that were, in their way, as angular and unadorned as the landscape outside, all bone and line and shadow, with no softness that was not earned and no warmth that was not deliberate. I asked him, as the train slowed for Guildford, whether the outcome satisfied him. He did not answer immediately. The train stopped. Passengers boarded. A door slammed. The whistle blew. We moved again, and only then, as if the motion of the train had released something the stillness of the platform had held in check, did he speak. The mechanism of the crime was simple, Watson. A passage, a conspiracy, a will with a conditional clause. Any competent investigator could have traced the passage. Any competent solicitor could have identified the vulnerability in the will. The physical facts of this case are, in the final accounting, pedestrian. He paused. The fields outside had given way to the suburban sprawl that marks the approach to London, houses pressing closer together, gardens shrinking, the green of the countryside yielding to the gray of brick and slate. But the motive was not simple. Mrs. Hartley did not act from greed alone. Greed is acquisitive, and what she sought was not acquisition, but preservation. She did not want more than she had. She wanted to keep what she had, and the threat to what she had was not an enemy or a rival, but a niece, a girl she had raised, fed, nursed, educated, and loved in whatever form her love took. The threat was intimacy itself. Constance's marriage would not have harmed Hartley through malice. It would have harmed her through indifference, the slow, courteous, inevitable displacement of an aging woman by the demands of a new household. And Hartley, who had spent 9 years making herself indispensable, could not bear to become dispensable. She wrapped her loneliness in pragmatism. She dressed her resentment in the language of rights and arrangements. And when the moment came, she commissioned a murder and called it self-preservation. The train entered the long cutting before Waterloo, and the light in the compartment dimmed as the embankment walls rose on either side. Holmes turned from the window and looked at me. Leonard Vane will be charged as an accessory. His grievance was genuine. The fraudulent codicil may well have existed, and the original succession may well have been corrupted. But genuine grievance does not authorize the abduction of an innocent woman, and the law will not distinguish between his intentions and Hartley's merely because his were less lethal. He built the machine. She changed its purpose. But it was his machine, and he placed it in the hands of a man he did not know, to use upon a woman he had never met, in service of a justice that existed only in his own accounting. He fell silent. The train emerged from the cutting. The river appeared. The Thames, gray and slow, catching the last light of the afternoon in dull silver patches between the bridges. We were close to London now, close to Baker Street, close to the rooms and the routine and the familiar, reliable architecture of our shared life. The tobacco in the Persian slipper, the unanswered correspondence pinned to the mantelpiece with a jackknife, the chemical apparatus on the dining table, the violin in its case by the window, all of it waiting, all of it unchanged. The world we returned to after each case, the world that absorbed us back into its rhythms as if we had never left, as if the things we had seen and the people we had encountered existed only within the boundaries of the investigation and dissolved, like morning frost, when the investigation ended. But they did not dissolve. I knew that. Constance Radcliffe would not dissolve. She would wake tomorrow in Amnerley Grange, her house now, legally and irrevocably, beside a husband who loved her more than she yet loved him, in a room above a churchyard where the yew trees stood as they had stood for 8 centuries, indifferent to the dramas conducted beneath their branches. And beneath the church, the passage would remain, sealed again, forgotten again, but present, a darkness running under the foundations of a place of worship like a fault line in stone, invisible until the weight above it shifts. The train slowed. Waterloo appeared, the great arched roof, the steam, the noise of a London terminus at the end of a working day. Holmes rose and gathered his things with the economical movements I knew so well, and I followed, and we walked together through the crowd and out into the evening air. I set down this account some weeks later, in the sitting room at Baker Street, with the spring evening darkening outside the windows and the gas lamps lit along the street below. Holmes was out. Where, I did not ask. He would tell me, or he would not, and I had long since made my peace with the boundaries of his confidence. The fire was low. The room was quiet. And as I wrote the final words, I found myself thinking not of the deductions or the evidence or the mechanism of the crime, but of a question Constance Radcliffe had asked me in a lamplit room at the Lamb and Anchor, a question I had answered honestly and inadequately, and which I have carried with me since. Can a person love someone and still destroy them? I have written elsewhere of the horrors that men inflict upon strangers, but I confess that no case has taught me so bitter a lesson as this, that the hand which braids your hair in childhood may be the same hand that seals your tomb.